Hey there. Welcome back to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping into Harlem, into the story of a man who lived two lives. By day, he was the polished businessman who bought the legendary Apollo Theater, a symbol of pride in Black America. By night, he was one of the most powerful heroin kingpins New York had ever seen, Guy Fisher, a man who rose from the Bronx projects to sit at the table of Harlem's drug lords, who dared to chase legitimacy while still knee-deep in the game, and who would ultimately pay the highest price for breaking a sacred code. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? It never gets old seeing this strange little underworld of our stretch across cities and time zones. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Around here, we tell the stories of gangsters, hustlers, and outlaws in a way you won't hear anywhere else. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. So take a breath, let the noise of the day fade away, and follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, South Bronx Beginnings. The story of Guy Fisher doesn't begin with the Apollo Theater's bright lights or the council's shadowy boardroom. It begins in a cramped apartment in the Patterson houses in the South Bronx, where survival was less about ambition and more about making it through the day. Picture it, peeling paint on the walls, heat that didn't always work in the winter, and the kind of silence that wasn't really silence at all, just the muffled echo of arguments in the next apartment, the rumble of the subway in the distance, and the street outside that never slept. Years later, people would remember Guy as sharp, ambitious, almost polished. But back then, he was just another kid running through stairwells, dodging trouble, trying to carve out a sense of identity in a place where dreams rarely left the block. The Patterson houses in the 1950s and 60s were a concrete fortress for the working poor, a place meant to provide shelter, but often delivering struggle. Families packed into small spaces, children fighting over scraps of opportunity. It was the kind of place that raised fighters, kids who grew up fast, kids who learned early that nothing was free. For Guy, being the oldest of 5 meant responsibility fell on him before he ever had the chance to really be a child. He was the one who had to step up, the one who couldn't afford weakness. That weight sat heavy on his shoulders, shaping his pride and sharpening his instincts. He saw his mother working to keep food on the table, saw the grind in her eyes, and he learned that in this world, respect didn't come automatically. You had to take it. You had to project it, like armor, or the world would eat you alive. The Bronx was alive with contradictions. On one corner, you had the sound of Motown slipping out of windows, kids dancing, the joy of Black culture shaping the rhythm of the city. On another corner, you had heroin needles in the gutter, men nodding off on stoops, and cops prowling like predators. To a boy like Guy, this was more than a neighborhood. It was a classroom. Every day, every interaction was a lesson, and the lessons were harsh. There were days when he could feel the pull of 2 different futures. One where he stayed in school, played by the rules, tried to climb the ladder rung by rung, and another where the streets whispered promises of fast cash, sharp suits, and the kind of respect no classroom could teach. Those whispers got louder as the 60s wore on. Drugs flooded the city, crime seeped into every crack of the pavement, and a new breed of hustlers emerged. They weren't just corner boys. They were businessmen, at least in their own eyes. They understood supply and demand. They understood image, and they understood fear. For Guy, hustling wasn't just about greed. It was about survival. The little money he made on the streets helped his family, put clothes on his siblings' backs, food in their mouths. But it was also intoxicating. A fistful of dollars felt like freedom. A brand new pair of sneakers felt like power. And every nod of recognition from older hustlers in the neighborhood fed his ambition. It was like stepping onto a stage for the first time and realizing the audience was watching. He learned quickly that charisma could be just as dangerous as a pistol. Some hustlers relied on muscle, others on intimidation. Guy leaned into charm. He dressed clean, talked smooth, and carried himself with a confidence that set him apart. People noticed. Women, hustlers, even cops. They saw a young man who didn't just want to survive, he wanted to rise. But the streets have a way of testing ambition. Petty hustles led to bigger risks. Bigger risks meant bigger consequences. Guy's first brushes with the law were like warning shots, moments that could have scared him straight. But instead, they hardened him. Each run-in reminded him that the system wasn't built for kids from Patterson houses. Judges didn't see potential in young black boys from the Bronx. They saw statistics. They saw the next number on a rap sheet. That realization carved something deep inside Guy. A refusal to be another faceless story of failure. Still, temptation never stopped knocking. He'd walk home past drug dealers in Cadillacs, men with diamond watches and leather coats, men who had once been just like him. And when you grow up with so little, seeing someone who looks like you, from your block, living like royalty, it's almost impossible not to believe that could be you. That was the contradiction eating at Guy Fisher's soul. He knew the streets could destroy him, but they also offered the only visible escape from poverty. By the time Guy was a teenager, he carried himself like someone older. He wasn't the type to draw attention by starting fights or bragging loudly. He was patient, observant, watching how the game was played. That patience made him different. The streets respected a man who could keep his cool. And in a neighborhood where tempers were quick and life was cheap, calm confidence was a weapon in itself. Yet even as he started finding his footing, danger lurked everywhere. The South Bronx in the 60s was burning, literally. Fires ripped through tenements. Landlords collected insurance and left families homeless. The city was falling apart, and in that chaos, crime thrived. Gangs carved up corners, dealers spread poison, and cops grew more corrupt. For a boy with ambition, the line between opportunity and downfall was paper thin. Guy walked that line every single day. One step could mean a pocket full of cash. The next could mean a night in a cell. He felt the weight of both paths pressing on him, the constant tension between responsibility and temptation. He wanted more for his family, but the cost of that more was starting to show. Nights where he came home with a wad of bills, his mother's silence said everything. Pride and disappointment mixed in her eyes, a cocktail of emotions only a mother can carry. She knew the streets were swallowing her son, but what choice did he really have? The Bronx was full of kids who never made it past their teens. Kids who overdosed, kids who caught bullets, kids who disappeared into the prison system. Guy could feel that reality breathing down his neck, like a shadow following him through every hallway, every corner, every deal. He knew he was gambling with his future, but the thrill of beating the odds was like fire in his veins. And once you taste that fire, it's almost impossible to turn away. One night, walking home from a late hustle, Guy caught his reflection in a store window. He paused. The boy staring back at him was changing. Sharper, harder, older. The innocence of childhood was gone, replaced by something else, something hungrier. He realized then that he was no longer just playing the game. He was becoming part of it. The streets weren't just background noise anymore. They were pulling him in, shaping him, molding him into someone who couldn't be ignored. That reflection would haunt him for years, because deep down, he knew the path he was walking didn't end with peace. It ended with betrayal, blood, or bars. But in that moment, under the flickering neon lights of a South Bronx bodega, all he could see was possibility. All he could feel was the rush of being noticed, respected, feared. For a boy from Patterson houses, that felt like destiny. And yet, destiny has a way of demanding its price. Guy Fisher's story was only beginning. The choices he made in those early years were laying the foundation for everything to come. The loyalty he would inspire, the enemies he would make, the empire he would one day build. But for now, he was still just a kid in the Bronx, caught between the weight of family responsibility and the seductive call of the streets. What he didn't know was that his hunger, his ambition, would lead him straight into the orbit of men who ran Harlem with an iron grip. Men whose names carried fear like thunder. And once he stepped into their world, there would be no turning back. Because in Harlem, the stakes were higher, the rewards greater, and the code stricter. And breaking that code would come at the cost of everything. Chapter 2: Harlem's Young Hustler. It starts with the glow of neon lights on Lenox Avenue, the kind of glow that makes every hustler feel like a star for a moment. The Bronx was where Guy Fisher was forged, but Harlem was where he would be tested, where temptation wasn't just whispered, it was shouted from every corner, from every Cadillac that rolled slow past the curb, from every suit sharper than a razor's edge. Harlem in the late 1960s was alive, restless, dangerous, and magnetic. And for a young man like Guy, it was impossible to stay away. Picture it. A Friday night, the sidewalks crowded, the smell of fried chicken and hot pretzels mixing with the sweet stink of heroin smoke. Street lights cast long shadows where deals were made in quick handshakes, money folded into palms slick with anticipation. And there, slipping through it all with that quiet confidence, was Guy. Clean shirt, pressed slacks, shoes shining like glass. He didn't just walk into Harlem. He arrived like someone stepping onto a stage. The block noticed. People always noticed him. By then, Guy had outgrown the small hustles of the Bronx. Selling stolen goods, flipping small-time product, it wasn't enough. Harlem offered scale, and with scale came respect. Here, the game wasn't just about staying alive. It was about being somebody, about being known. The older hustlers saw it in him right away. That posture, that cool. He wasn't loud, he wasn't reckless, but he carried an energy that demanded attention. In the world of hustling, charisma was a currency, and Guy spent it wisely. The underground economy of Harlem worked like an invisible city layered beneath the real one. On the surface, you had barbershops, bodegas, and pool halls. Underneath, you had cut houses, stash spots, and corners where money changed hands faster than a taximeter. Hustling wasn't just selling drugs. It was running numbers, fencing stolen goods, loan sharking. Each hustle was like a river, and they all flowed into Harlem's ocean of organized crime. Guy was learning to swim in it, and he was learning fast. What set him apart wasn't just ambition. It was the way he made people feel. A loan shark might scare you into paying. A dealer might flash a pistol to keep you loyal. Guy, he made you believe in him. He made you feel like being around him was an opportunity, and that was far more powerful than fear. Fear fades. Respect lingers. Still, respect had to be earned, and in Harlem, earning it meant risk. He started taking chances, small at first, running errands for bigger players, delivering packages that he didn't ask too many questions about. It was the kind of work where one wrong move could end with a knife in the ribs or a stretch behind bars. But each job completed, each night survived, built his reputation brick by brick. People started to know his name. Not the whole neighborhood. Not yet. But enough of the right people. The money was better than anything he had seen before. A roll of bills fat enough to feel heavy in his pocket. For a kid who grew up watching his mother stretch every dollar until it snapped, that kind of money felt unreal. But it wasn't just the money. It was the look in people's eyes when he walked into a room. The nods of recognition. The quiet whispers. That was what hooked him. The sense that he was no longer invisible. Yet beneath the glamour, the danger was constant. Harlem in those days was flooded with heroin. They called it smack, and it was everywhere. The addicts were like ghosts wandering through the streets, selling everything they owned just to chase the next high. For hustlers, heroin was gold. For the community, it was poison. And Guy, standing on the edge of that trade, could see both sides. He saw the addicts nodding out on the steps, and he saw the hustlers driving luxury cars that most working men could never dream of affording. That contradiction was the beating heart of Harlem. It was intoxicating and horrifying all at once. One night, outside a Harlem nightclub, Guy watched a dealer pull up in a brand-new Cadillac, the chrome reflecting the city lights like liquid silver. The man stepped out in a mink coat, rings on every finger, and the crowd around him parted like he was royalty. Guy couldn't look away. That image burned itself into his mind, not because of the car or the coat, but because of the power it represented, the kind of power that made men untouchable, at least for a while. He wanted that. Not the flash, not the jewelry, but the respect. The certainty that when he walked into a room, everyone would know he was somebody. But ambition is like fire. It lights your path, but it can also burn you alive. The deeper Guy went into Harlem's underground, the more he realized how ruthless it was. Deals went bad. Friends turned on each other. And the police were always lurking, watching, waiting. Every decision was a gamble. Every handshake a potential betrayal. To survive, he had to play it smarter than the rest. He had to be 2 steps ahead. He kept his circle small, trusted few, and listened more than he spoke. That patience paid off. Older hustlers started giving him more responsibility, bigger roles, larger pieces of the action. He wasn't just running errands anymore. He was making decisions, moving weight, handling money. And through it all, he never lost that charm. He could talk to the roughest street hustler 1 minute and hold a conversation with a businessman the next. That ability to move between worlds would become his greatest weapon. Harlem loved confidence, but it also loved style. And Guy had both. He started dressing sharper, wearing suits that fit like they were cut just for him. He drove cars that turned heads without screaming for attention. He understood the importance of image in a world where perception was reality. In the streets, how you looked was almost as important as what you did. It was theater, and Guy was learning to play the leading role. But behind the smiles and the shine, he carried the weight of his choices. He still thought about his family, about the siblings who looked up to him, about his mother who worried silently every time he came home late. He knew he was walking a dangerous path. He knew the streets took as much as they gave. Yet the lure of Harlem was too strong. Each success pulled him deeper. Each risk made it harder to turn back. He was in the current now, and the current was only getting stronger. The South Bronx had taught him resilience. Harlem was teaching him ambition. Together, they were shaping him into someone who could rise higher than anyone expected. But with every step upward, the stakes grew. The money was bigger, the enemy sharper, the attention unavoidable. And in Harlem, too much attention was a dangerous thing. Late one night, standing on a corner under the flicker of a street lamp, Guy felt the shift. He wasn't just another hustler anymore. People looked at him differently. They expected more from him. They wanted to know what moves he was making, who he was connected to, where his next step would lead. That realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Because in Harlem's underground, rising up meant stepping onto a stage where the spotlight never turned off. And once you were in that light, every mistake, every weakness, every betrayal was magnified. As he leaned against the cold brick wall, watching the traffic roll by, Guy felt a chill run through him. Not from the night air, but from the knowledge that he was being watched. Not just by the hustlers on the block, not just by the cops circling like vultures, but by men whose power stretched far beyond Harlem streets. Men who controlled supply lines, distribution networks, entire empires built on heroin. Men whose approval, or disapproval, could decide whether a hustler lived or died. And soon, Guy Fisher would be standing in front of them. Chapter 3, Meeting Nicky Barnes. The night he first laid eyes on the man who would change his life, Harlem felt like it was holding its breath. The streets were restless, the clubs alive, and every hustler knew whose name carried the most weight. Leroy Nicky Barnes. They called him Mr. Untouchable. The kingpin who wore silk suits like armor and carried himself like a politician with an army. Meeting him wasn't just luck. It was like stepping into the orbit of a planet that pulled everything around it into motion. And for Guy Fisher, that gravity was irresistible. Imagine walking into a Harlem nightclub in the early 1970s. Smoke curls through the air, laughter blends with a bass line of soul music, and every table is a kingdom of its own. Hustlers, singers, dealers, and dreamers all packed together under one roof. But there's always one table that commands more attention than the rest. That night, it belonged to Nicky. He sat in the center like a conductor, his lieutenants around him, women draped across the booth, and eyes fixed on him with a mix of envy and fear. To the untrained eye, he looked like just another flashy figure in Harlem's nightlife. But to those who understood, he was the heartbeat of the heroin trade. Guy stood at a distance, his expression calm, his posture confident. He had seen plenty of big shots before, men who thought they ran the block. But Nicky was different. There was a presence about him, a silence that didn't need noise to be noticed. The room bent around him, and Guy felt it immediately. He knew that if he was going to rise beyond street corners and small hustles, it wouldn't happen in the shadows. It would happen in circles like this, where men like Nicky decided who rose and who fell. Introductions in Harlem's underworld weren't casual. They were orchestrated, weighed, and measured. The man who introduced Guy knew exactly what he was doing. He brought him to the table, leaned in, and spoke with the kind of reverence reserved for royalty. And there it was, Guy Fisher, face to face with the man whose empire defined Harlem streets. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Nicky saw not just another young hustler. He saw ambition polished into charm, a man who carried himself with discipline, not recklessness. Guy saw power cloaked in control, a man who had turned the chaos of the streets into a carefully managed empire. Nicky was more than a dealer. He was a strategist. He didn't run Harlem through brute force alone. He ran it like a boardroom, with rules, codes, and structure. To survive in his world, you had to understand that heroin wasn't just a drug. It was a business. A multinational corporation disguised as corner transactions. Supply chains stretched overseas. Profits flowed like rivers through laundromats, clubs, and storefronts. And Nicky, at the center, was the CEO. Meeting him was like shaking hands with Wall Street in a silk tie, except his stock was powder, and his dividends were counted in cash and blood. Guy listened more than he spoke that night. That was his gift. Where others might trip over themselves trying to impress, Guy knew the value of patience. He let Nicky talk, let him measure him in silence. And Nicky, sharp as ever, saw the difference. He saw a man who didn't need to prove himself with loud words. A man who understood that survival in this game wasn't about bravado. It was about discipline. That was what caught his eye. Outside the club, the cold Harlem air carried the faint wail of sirens. Guy stood there, the city pressing in around him, replaying the conversation in his mind. It wasn't much, just words exchanged across a crowded booth. But it was enough. He knew doors had cracked open, and behind those doors lay opportunity and danger. Because aligning yourself with Nicky Barnes wasn't just an introduction into higher levels of hustling. It was a pact, a step into a world where the stakes were life and death, where loyalty was currency, and betrayal was punished without mercy. Over the weeks that followed, Guy found himself pulled closer into Nicky's circle. He ran errands, handled business, proved his reliability in small but important ways. Each task was a test, and each time he passed, Nicky's trust deepened. Slowly, the relationship shifted. Guy was no longer just a young hustler on the rise. He was becoming part of something bigger, a network that spanned Harlem like veins beneath the skin, pumping heroin and money with mechanical precision. Nicky took a liking to him, not just for his charm, but for his discipline. In a world full of hustlers quick to spend their money on cars and women, Guy stood out. He enjoyed the lifestyle, yes, but he carried himself with restraint. He thought long-term. He wasn't reckless, and Nicky valued that. To Nicky, discipline was the difference between a hustler who burned bright and died fast, and a man who built an empire. He began to see in Guy a reflection of his own ambition, a younger version of himself with the potential to carry the torch. The bond between them wasn't just business. It was mentorship, a twisted form of fatherhood. Nicky taught him how to move silently, how to negotiate, how to handle betrayal. He explained the codes of the street like a professor lecturing in a classroom. Never sleep with another man's woman. Always pay legal fees for your brothers. Keep disputes within the family. These weren't just rules. They were the glue that held the empire together. And Guy absorbed them all, not as suggestions, but as scripture. But there was something else Guy noticed, something that stayed with him long after those nights in Harlem's clubs and apartments. Nicky was a man at war with himself. On the surface, he was untouchable, a kingpin basking in the glow of wealth and power. But behind his eyes, there was tension, the constant paranoia of being hunted, the knowledge that every move was being watched, that every ally could turn into an enemy. Guy could see it in the way Nicky sometimes paused mid-conversation, scanning the room, his mind calculating threats no one else noticed. For all his power, Nicky lived in a cage of his own making, built from distrust and fear. Guy understood that fear. He felt it too, creeping into the edges of his ambition. Because stepping into Nicky's world meant stepping into the line of fire. Law enforcement wasn't blind. They knew who Nicky was, and they were relentless in their pursuit. Every day, agents and prosecutors mapped out his empire, waiting for the moment to strike. And by standing at his side, Guy was painting a target on his own back. But ambition doesn't always listen to fear. It listens to hunger. And Guy's hunger was insatiable. The deeper he went, the more he realized Nicky's empire wasn't invincible. Yes, it was powerful. Yes, it was organized. But it was also fragile, balanced on trust and silence. One broken rule, one loose tongue, one act of betrayal, and the whole thing could crumble. Guy tucked that knowledge away, even as he embraced the opportunity Nicky was giving him. Because in Harlem, knowledge was survival, and survival was everything. One evening, after a long meeting where plans were whispered over whiskey and cigarette smoke, Nicky leaned close to Guy and said something that would echo in his mind for years. You've got what most of these cats don't. Discipline. That's why you'll last. But don't ever forget, this life don't forgive mistakes. It was both a blessing and a warning, a hand extended and a knife held behind the back. And Guy knew it. He knew that mentorship in this world wasn't unconditional. It was temporary, fragile, and it came with an expiration date written in betrayal or bullets. As he walked home through the Harlem night, the city buzzing with energy and danger, Guy couldn't shake the weight of those words. He was moving up, faster than he ever imagined, but each step forward was a step deeper into the quicksand. He could feel it pulling at his ankles, the streets tightening their grip. He thought of his family, of the Bronx, of the boy who once stared at his reflection in a store window and saw hunger staring back. That boy had found his path, but it was a path paved with risk. And now, under the mentorship of Harlem's kingpin, the stakes had never been higher. Because meeting Nicky Barnes wasn't just the beginning of an alliance. It was the beginning of a destiny that would bind them together in loyalty and, eventually, in betrayal. A destiny that would lift Guy Fisher to heights he never dreamed of, and then drag him into the depths he could never escape. And as the night closed in around him, Guy Fisher had no idea that the man he now called mentor would one day become the very reason he lost. Chapter 4. The Council is Born. The room was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that only comes when power is being arranged, when the air itself feels charged with something permanent. It wasn't a courtroom, but it might as well have been. 7 men sat around a table in Harlem, and though no judge presided, a verdict was being delivered that would shape the streets for years to come. They weren't politicians. They weren't businessmen in the traditional sense. They were drug lords, bound together by greed, ambition, and survival. This was the night the council was born, and at that table, the youngest face among them belonged to Guy Fisher. Nicky Barnes had grown tired of chaos. Harlem's heroin trade was profitable, yes, but it was also unstable. Too many crews fighting over corners, too many disputes spilling into blood on the sidewalk. For a man who saw himself as more than just a gangster, this was unacceptable. He wanted order. He wanted structure. And so he did what no one had done before. He built a syndicate, not a loose alliance, not a handshake deal, but an actual governing body for crime, modeled on the mafia's commission. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was brilliant. The men chosen for this council weren't picked at random. They were selected with precision, like chess pieces placed on a board. Each one controlled a slice of Harlem's trade. Together, they would eliminate disputes, regulate supply, and enforce discipline. If one member was arrested, the others would contribute to legal fees. If one member stepped out of line, the others would judge him. The streets would no longer dictate the flow of power. This table would. And the youngest man given a seat at it was Guy Fisher, barely into his 30s, but already carrying himself like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. To Guy, it was surreal. Not long ago, he was just another hustler in the South Bronx, running errands, dreaming of respect. Now, he was sitting shoulder to shoulder with Harlem's most feared and respected men. Some of them had reputations carved in blood, others in sheer business acumen. He had both to prove and everything to gain. And though he masked it behind his calm demeanor, the weight of that responsibility pressed on him like a stone. He knew one wrong move could erase him as quickly as he had been elevated. The council had rules, and they weren't suggestions. Rule 1, never betray your brothers. Rule 2, never sleep with another member's wife or mistress. Rule 3, always contribute to the collective defense. Money for lawyers, money for silence, money for the machine that kept them untouchable. It was a code meant to prevent jealousy, betrayal, and the kind of petty disputes that toppled empires. For a while it worked. Violence decreased. Profits soared. And the council became something Harlem had never seen before, a board of directors for the drug trade. Guy listened carefully in those meetings. He watched the way Nicky commanded the room without shouting, the way decisions were made with a nod, a glance, a subtle gesture that meant more than words. He studied the older men, their pride, their paranoia, their hunger. He took mental notes, understanding that survival at this level wasn't about muscle. It was about intelligence, discipline, and the ability to see 5 moves ahead. Every smile hid suspicion. Every handshake could one day be a dagger. But Guy knew he had something unique to offer: youth, ambition, and an ability to walk in both worlds, the underworld and the world of legitimate business. His presence on the council was symbolic too. He represented the next generation, the proof that Nicky Barnes was building something that could outlive him. The older members might have scoffed at first, but Guy earned his place. He didn't just want to be rich. He wanted to be respected. And respect, in this world, was rarer than gold. The council operated like a shadow government. They set prices for heroin, controlled distribution, and even arbitrated disputes between crews. If someone wanted to move product in Harlem, they either paid respect or paid with their life. The streets whispered about it, half in fear, half in admiration. To many, it felt like Harlem finally had its own version of the mafia. But unlike the mafia, these men weren't hiding behind ethnicity or centuries-old tradition. They were black men from Harlem, carving out their own empire in a city that never expected them to rise this high. For Guy, every meeting was another education. He learned how to launder money through businesses, how to manage supply without drawing too much attention, how to mask power with humility. He began investing in real estate, opening clubs, setting the stage for the day when he could stand on equal footing with legitimate businessmen. That was his edge. He wasn't just a drug lord. He was a man who dreamed of building something that could last, something that could stand even if the streets crumbled. In his mind, the Apollo Theater wasn't just a purchase waiting to happen. It was destiny. But for now, destiny had to wait. The council demanded his focus. And yet, even within this new order, tension lingered. Trust was fragile. Pride was volatile. Each member of the council was powerful in his own right, and egos clashed behind closed doors. Nicky held them together, but everyone knew that unity built on fear and greed was a fragile thing. All it would take was one broken rule, one betrayal, and the entire structure could collapse. Guy saw it. He felt it. And deep down, he wondered how long this fragile empire could last. Still, for the moment, life was good. Money flowed in rivers, so much that counting houses had to be set up just to manage it. The council's decisions stabilized the market, eliminated unnecessary bloodshed, and maximized profits. Dealers down the chain respected the order, if only because they knew the consequences of disrespect. Harlem pulsed with wealth, even as it bled from addiction. The contradiction was staggering. Families destroyed on one block, luxury cars gleaming on the next. And, at the center of it, Guy Fisher, the kid from the Patterson houses, now a king among men. But with power came visibility, and with visibility came risk. The council's very success drew the eyes of law enforcement. Federal agents began mapping their network, watching their movements, tapping their phones. They called it an enterprise, a continuing criminal conspiracy, and they were determined to bring it down. For now, the council moved in shadows, confident in its rules, secure in its silence. But the walls were closing in, brick by brick, and none of them could see it yet. Guy, for all his discipline, wasn't blind to the danger. He knew that being part of the council meant his every move was magnified, his every decision scrutinized. He also knew that loyalty in this world was conditional, tested constantly. One day, the very man who brought him into this circle would become the man who destroyed him. But in these early years, Guy couldn't imagine that betrayal. He couldn't imagine that the mentor he admired, the man who had given him a seat at the table, would one day sit in a courtroom and point his finger in his direction. For now, Guy sat in those meetings, his expression calm, his mind racing, his ambition burning. He was part of history being written in smoke and whispers, a chapter of Harlem that would be remembered long after the council was gone. He was no longer just hustling on the corners. He was shaping policy in the underworld, one decision at a time. And as he left one of those meetings late at night, stepping into the Harlem air, he paused for a moment under the streetlight. He thought of the boy he once was, staring at his reflection in a store window, hungry for more. That boy had found his way here, into the very heart of power. But with power came shadows, and those shadows were growing darker by the day, because empires built on fear have a way of devouring themselves. And the council, for all its brilliance, was no exception. Chapter 5: Rules of the Brotherhood. The first time Guy sat through a council meeting where the rules were laid out, he felt it like a weight pressing on his chest. These weren't suggestions or friendly agreements. They were commandments, laws etched in stone, enforced not by courts or judges, but by men whose justice came quick and final. Loyalty, respect, no betrayal. Break those rules, and your name could vanish from Harlem overnight, erased in blood. The code wasn't written on paper, but everyone in that room understood it as clearly as scripture. The rules were simple on the surface, but heavy with meaning. Never steal from another member. Always contribute to the collective defense fund. Never speak to law enforcement. Handle disputes inside the circle, never outside it. And the most personal of all, never touch another member's woman. That last one wasn't just about jealousy. It was about trust. In a world where everyone was watching their back, the sanctity of family was untouchable. Violate it, and you didn't just lose your seat at the table. You lost your life. Guy listened, quiet as always, taking it all in. The older men in the room nodded along, some with expressions hardened by years of betrayal and blood. For them, these rules were survival distilled into a code. For Guy, they were more than that. They were a framework, a way to take chaos and mold it into something resembling order. The code gave meaning to his ambition, boundaries for his hunger. It allowed him to rise without stumbling into the kind of mistakes that destroyed so many hustlers before him. But rules in Harlem's underworld weren't like the rules of ordinary life. They weren't written to protect the innocent or preserve fairness. They were written to keep the machine running. Imagine gears grinding inside a clock, each one essential, each one moving in time with the others. If one gear jammed, the whole mechanism failed. That was the council's logic. Keep the gears moving smoothly, no matter the cost. And if a man had to be broken in the process, so be it. Guy thrived under this system. He had always been disciplined, always carried himself with restraint. While other hustlers flashed their cash and flaunted their power, Guy played it cool. He invested, he planned, he thought ahead. The rules weren't a burden to him. They were an advantage. They rewarded his patience, his ability to control his impulses. He didn't just follow the code. He embodied it. And because of that, his stature within the council grew. The council enforced the rules with terrifying consistency. When a member's loyalty was questioned, it wasn't debated for long. Decisions were swift, punishments harsher than any courtroom could deliver. One whispered accusation could lead to a disappearance, a man's body found in a shallow grave, or sometimes never found at all. Everyone knew this. Everyone accepted it. That acceptance was what kept the council strong, what allowed it to function with the efficiency of a corporation. Fear was the glue, but discipline was the spine. Guy remembered one particular meeting where tensions nearly tore the table apart. Two members were at odds over territory, voices rising, tempers threatening to spill into violence. But then the rules came into play. The argument was cut off, the council deliberated, and a decision was handed down like a verdict. The losing party accepted it in silence, his pride swallowed, his life spared because he abided by the code. To outsiders, it might have looked like weakness. To those inside, it was strength. The rules worked. They kept blood off the table, even if it spilled elsewhere. For Guy, the rules also carried a personal weight. Loyalty wasn't just about protecting the business. It was about protecting his family. He knew that if he ever slipped, if he ever betrayed the trust of his brothers, it wouldn't just be him who paid the price. His loved ones could be dragged into the crossfire. That knowledge sharpened his focus. It made him careful with his words, deliberate with his actions. Every move was calculated, every decision filtered through the code. He wasn't just surviving. He was mastering the art of survival. And yet, beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The rules that bound them together were also chains, and chains have a way of creating resentment. Prideful men chafed under restrictions, whispered about bending the code when it suited them. Guy noticed it, the subtle looks, the half-hidden doubts. He understood that as strong as the rules were, they were only as strong as the men who chose to follow them. And men, by nature, were flawed. Still, for now, the council thrived. Money poured in, violence was contained, and the streets respected the order. Dealers paid their dues, runners moved in silence, and the machine hummed. The council became a myth as much as a reality. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as if it were an invisible hand guiding Harlem's underworld. And in many ways it was. But every myth carries a seed of destruction, a hidden flaw waiting to unravel it. Guy felt the weight of that flaw in quiet moments. Late at night, lying awake, he would replay the meetings in his mind. The solemn vows, the unspoken threats, the sense that everything they had built rested on a knife's edge. He knew that codes kept men in line only until something stronger pulled them apart. Greed, lust, betrayal. He pushed those thoughts away, focusing instead on his own path, his own rise. But deep down, he sensed that the rules that made the council powerful would one day become the same rules that tore it apart. Still, he leaned into the discipline. He wore it like a second skin. The council saw him as reliable, trustworthy, a man who would never stray from the code. That reputation was priceless. It bought him influence, protection, and a place at the table where decisions were made. And with that place came opportunity, the kind of opportunity that would eventually lead him far beyond the streets, into the very heart of Harlem's cultural legacy. But that moment was still ahead. For now, he was building a foundation, brick by brick, rule by rule. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, Guy stepped outside into the Harlem night. The city buzzed with energy, cars honking, voices echoing, the rhythm of life pulsing through the streets. He looked up at the skyline, the glow of lights against the dark sky, and felt the strange contradiction of his existence. He was part of something powerful, something organized, something bigger than himself. And yet, it was fragile, balanced on human weakness, destined to crack under the weight of its own rules. He felt it in his bones, though he couldn't yet see how it would unfold. Because every rule has a breaking point. Every code has a flaw. And for the council, that flaw would one day cut straight through the very heart of loyalty. Chapter 6. The Business of Heroin. The first time Guy Fisher watched a bundle of heroin bricks being cut open, the sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Wrapped tight, stamped with logos like luxury goods, they looked less like contraband and more like expensive imports. In a way, that's exactly what they were. Harlem's drug economy wasn't random. It was organized, precise, and as relentless as any Fortune 500 company. The product came from overseas, filtered through ports and middlemen, packaged, and pushed down into the veins of the city. By the time it reached the streets, it was poison disguised as opportunity. And now, Guy was one of the men making sure the flow never stopped. Heroin in the 1970s was more than a drug. It was a machine. At the top were the suppliers, often tied to international connections stretching from Turkey to Southeast Asia. At the bottom were the users, hollow-eyed, desperate, trading dignity for a fix. In between stood an army of dealers, runners, and enforcers. The council sat at the very center, controlling the arteries of distribution like surgeons with steady hands. They decided the prices. They managed the flow, and they punished anyone who disrupted the system. Guy wasn't just watching anymore. He was helping direct the current. Distribution was everything. Imagine water flowing through pipes beneath the city. If the pipes were blocked, neighborhoods dried up. If they burst, chaos flooded the streets. The council's genius was that they controlled the pipes. They decided how much product went to which corner, how much was cut, how much was sold pure. That control minimized conflict and maximized profit. Guy learned the intricacies of this system quickly. He studied it like a man studying an engine, each piece moving in harmony with the others. Cutting heroin was a science. Pure heroin was too strong to sell directly, too costly to waste. It had to be diluted, mixed with substances like lactose or quinine. That process stretched the product, increased the profits, and controlled the high. For every kilo that entered a cutting house, multiple kilos could be pushed onto the streets. It was simple multiplication, but multiplication fueled by suffering. Guy understood the numbers, but he also saw the faces. The addicts lined up in hallways, the bodies slumped on stairwells. The contradiction gnawed at him, even if he didn't say it out loud. Money poured in faster than most men could comprehend. Counting houses worked around the clock, employees stacking bills into neat bundles, rubber bands snapping under the strain. Some days, the cash was so heavy that duffel bags sagged like sacks of cement. Guy remembered standing in one of those rooms, the smell of ink and paper overwhelming, piles of cash higher than the furniture. It was intoxicating, yes, but also sobering. Money like that wasn't just wealth. It was a magnet for attention, both from enemies and from the government. The higher the stacks grew, the closer the walls of law enforcement seemed to press in. But unlike some of his peers, Guy didn't let the flood of cash blind him. Where others bought cars they couldn't park and jewelry they couldn't hide, Guy invested. He bought property, opened businesses, created fronts that could launder dirty money into clean. A barber shop here, a nightclub there, legitimate on the surface, pipelines beneath. He understood that money wasn't power until it was transformed. And transformation meant leaving the street corner behind, stepping into boardrooms, shaking hands in daylight instead of alleys. That vision set him apart. To the council, he wasn't just a loyal soldier. He was a strategist. He looked at the heroin trade not as a hustle, but as an empire. Each shipment was a supply chain. Each corner was a retail outlet. Each dealer was an employee. He even enforced rules of customer service. Product had to be reliable, deliveries had to be consistent, debts had to be managed. In a twisted way, it was capitalism in its rawest form, stripped of morality, but sharpened by necessity. Still, the dangers were everywhere. Cutting houses could be raided. Couriers could be robbed. A single loose tongue could unravel months of planning. Guy moved cautiously, surrounding himself with people he trusted, always watching for cracks in the system. He understood that the most dangerous weapon in this business wasn't a gun. It was information. A whisper to the wrong ears could kill an operation faster than a bullet ever could. He thrived under the council structure. His discipline made him reliable. His charm made him persuasive. And his ambition made him indispensable. As the heroin trade expanded, so did his role. He oversaw operations, managed disputes, and made decisions that rippled through Harlem like shockwaves. Each success cemented his reputation. Each failure tested his resilience. And through it all, he carried himself with the same calm confidence that had caught Nicky Barnes' eye in the first place. But behind the scenes, tension simmered. The heroin business was built on trust, Yet trust was the most fragile commodity of all. Dealers skimmed from shipments, couriers disappeared with product, enforcers grew greedy. Every problem had to be solved quickly and decisively. Sometimes that meant money. Sometimes that meant blood. Guy understood this cold reality. He didn't enjoy violence, but he didn't shy away from it either. In the council's world, mercy was a liability. Justice was swift and often final. What kept him going wasn't the thrill of the street. It was the vision of something bigger. He dreamed of building a legacy, of stepping out from the shadows of hustling and into the light of legitimate success. The heroin business was a means to an end, a way to climb out of poverty, to claim respect in a world that denied it to men like him. He knew the risk. He knew the cost. But the dream of sitting in a theater he owned, the legendary Apollo, kept the fire in him alive. Yet even as he dreamed, the machine kept grinding. Every day, heroin flowed through Harlem like blood through veins, feeding an addiction that destroyed families and hollowed out communities. Guy couldn't ignore that reality. He saw the children left behind, the mothers weeping in silence, the men wasted away before their time. He carried that knowledge with him, a quiet burden he never confessed. It was the price of ambition, the shadow behind the shine. And as much as he tried to focus on the business, the shadow never left. One night, after overseeing a shipment that moved without a hitch, Guy found himself standing alone on a Harlem rooftop. The city stretched before him, lights glowing, traffic humming like a heartbeat. In that moment, he felt both powerful and trapped. He had climbed higher than he ever imagined, but the higher he climbed, the harder the fall would be. He thought of the rules of the council, the code that kept them together, the discipline that had carried him this far. And he wondered how long could last. How long before greed cracked the code? How long before law enforcement tore the machine apart? How long before ambition became his undoing? Because in the business of heroin, there was no steady ground. Every success brought more danger. Every dollar earned carried a trace of death. And every dream of legitimacy was built on foundations that could collapse without warning. As he turned from the skyline, the wind cold against his face, Guy Fisher knew the machine was still moving. The gears were still grinding, and he was one of the men keeping it alive. But in the distance, beyond the glow of Harlem's lights, he could feel the shadows closing in. Chapter 7. Mr. Untouchable Spotlight. The magazine hit the stands on a Sunday morning, and by Monday, the streets of Harlem were buzzing with disbelief. There, on the glossy cover of the New York Times Magazine, was a face every hustler knew. The smooth features, the sharp suit, the cold eyes that revealed nothing. Leroy Nicky Barnes, smiling, confident, untouchable. The headline beneath him might as well have been a challenge to the world. Mr. Untouchable. In one instant, the quiet whispers of Harlem's underworld were dragged into the blinding glare of national attention. And that spotlight burned hotter than anyone could imagine. Guy Fisher remembered the first time he saw that cover. He was sitting in a Harlem cafe, the chatter of customers blending with the clatter of dishes, when someone slid the magazine across the table toward him. He froze, staring at it, the image searing into his mind. He knew power was seductive, that Nicky loved the aura of control. But this was dangerous. To be on the cover of one of the most respected publications in America wasn't just arrogance. It was an invitation, an open dare to law enforcement, prosecutors, and politicians. And they would not ignore it. For years, the council had thrived in shadows. Their rules kept the machine humming. Their discipline kept violence contained, and their profits soared beyond imagination. But shadows were safe only as long as the lights stayed dim. With that cover story, the lights had been switched on full force. The FBI, the DEA, the NYPD. Suddenly, every agency wanted a piece of the man who had declared himself untouchable. And by extension, they wanted a piece of everyone connected to him. To the hustlers on the street, the cover was legendary. It was proof that a black man from Harlem could rise so high that even the most prestigious paper in the country had to acknowledge him. To the addicts, it was a cruel reminder that the man behind their suffering lived like royalty. And to the council, it was a crack in the armor, a breach in the very code they had sworn to uphold. The code was built on silence, on discretion, on never drawing more attention than necessary. And now, their leader had put himself, and all of them, in the crosshairs. Nicky defended the cover as strategy. To him, it was image management, a way of controlling the narrative. If the government wanted to paint him as a criminal mastermind, he would lean into it, wear it like a crown. He believed power wasn't just in the streets. It was in perception. The stronger his image, the harder it would be for rivals to challenge him. But Guy saw the danger in his eyes, even if Nicky never admitted it. Behind the bravado, there was tension, because no matter how polished the magazine cover looked, it didn't change the reality that the government was already circling. Now they had blood in the water. Law enforcement responded with fury. Agents pinned that cover to their office walls like a target. Prosecutors carried it into meetings as fuel for their cases. Politicians waved it in front of cameras as proof that crime had become too brazen, too confident. The message was clear. This man thinks he's above the law, and we will prove him wrong. Suddenly, investigations that had been simmering boiled over. Wiretaps increased. Surveillance teams multiplied. Informants were pressed harder, squeezed tighter. Every move the council made was under a microscope, every step shadowed by eyes they couldn't see. For Guy, it was a moment of reckoning. He admired Nicky's confidence, yes, but he also knew that pride could be fatal. In their meetings, he stayed quiet, listening as others praised Nicky's boldness, whispering about how the cover elevated their legend. But inside, Guy felt the chill of inevitability. He knew empires didn't collapse in silence. They collapsed when they believed themselves invincible. And now, Harlem's most powerful man had declared to the world that he could not be touched. That kind of declaration was always answered. The streets shifted too. Rivals smelled opportunity. If the government was going after Nicky, maybe they could make moves in the shadows, test the boundaries, poke at the council's control. Every hustler wanted to see what untouchable really meant. Some feared it. Others dared to challenge it. And for the council, that meant doubling down, tightening control, enforcing rules with an iron hand, showing strength at every turn. The machine could not afford to appear weak. Not now. But cracks were already showing. Meetings grew tense. Conversations turned sharper. The council had always been a brotherhood, but with law enforcement pressure mounting, suspicion began to seep into the room. Who was being watched? Who might flip under pressure? Who could be trusted when the walls finally closed in? Guy noticed the way eyes lingered longer, the way silences stretched in uncomfortable directions. The code still held, but trust was thinning. The magazine cover also changed the way the community looked at them. Some people saw Nicky as a folk hero, a man who outwitted the system and flaunted his success. Others saw him as the reason their neighborhoods were drowning in addiction, the man profiting from their suffering while smiling on the cover of a national magazine. Harlem was divided, torn between pride and pain. And Guy, walking those streets, felt the weight of both sides pressing on him. Behind closed doors, law enforcement ramped up pressure on every front. They dug into bank accounts, tracked phone calls, raided stash houses. Each move tightened the net. Each operation brought them closer to the core. Agents described it like chasing smoke, slippery, elusive, always just out of reach. But now, thanks to that cover, they had a face to focus on, a symbol to bring down. And symbols, once chosen, never last forever. For Guy, the danger wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about perception inside the council itself. Nicky had made himself the star, the face of their empire. And in the underworld, stars burned fast. Some members admired him. Others resented the attention. They wondered if his ego was putting them all at risk. They wondered if the rules of silence had been broken beyond repair. And unspoken in those whispers was a dangerous thought. If Nicky fell, what would happen to the rest of them? Guy stayed disciplined, as always. He kept his moves quiet, his ambition cloaked in patience. But the more the spotlight grew, the harder it became to stay invisible. He knew that by being at Nicky's side, his own name was rising in the eyes of the government. He knew that every dollar he counted, every shipment he moved, every meeting he attended was now part of a larger case being built piece by piece. It was like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon, darkening by the day. You didn't know when the lightning would strike, but you knew it was coming. And yet, despite the danger, there was a strange allure to it. To see their leader on that cover, to see Harlem's underworld elevated to the level of national news, it was intoxicating. It was proof that they mattered, that their power was undeniable. For a moment, it felt like validation of everything they had built, every risk they had taken. But beneath that rush was fear. Fear that the spotlight wasn't just shining, it was burning. The council continued to meet, to plan, to move product. The money still flowed, the machines still operated. But the rhythm had changed. It was no longer smooth, no longer effortless. It was frantic, urgent, a race against time. Everyone felt it, though no one dared to say it aloud. The question hung heavy in the air. How long could they really stay untouchable? Guy thought of his own future often during those days. He thought of the businesses he wanted to build, the theater he dreamed of owning, the chance to step into legitimacy. But he also thought of the risks, the inevitability of the fall. He couldn't shake the sense that they had crossed a line, that the cover had tipped the scales. What had once been whispers in the dark was now shouted across headlines. And headlines had a way of writing their own endings. One night, as he walked out of a meeting, the streets unusually quiet, Guy paused under a flickering street lamp. He thought of the code, of the rules that had held them together, of the silence that had once been their shield. And he realized that silence had been broken, not by betrayal, but by pride. Pride that dared the world to strike back. Pride that declared invincibility in a game where no one truly was. Because no matter how strong you are, no matter how much discipline you carry, no one stays untouchable forever. And as the city around him seemed to hold its breath, Guy Fisher understood that the storm was closer than ever. Chapter 8. The Barnes Trial. The sound of the gavel striking echoed like a gunshot in the courtroom. For a moment, the entire room held its breath, as though even the walls were leaning in to catch the verdict. This wasn't just another trial. This was the government versus a man who had branded himself Mr. Untouchable. Leroy Nicky Barnes, Harlem's kingpin, sat at the defense table in a crisp suit, expression calm, eyes unreadable. The empire he had built in whispers and shadows was being dragged into the light. And sitting close by, another man faced his own fate, Guy Fisher, the youngest of the council, now tangled in the net that law enforcement had spent years weaving. The trial was spectacle and theater, equal parts drama and strategy. Prosecutors painted Barnes as the architect of a heroin empire that poisoned Harlem, detailing shipments, distribution networks, and piles of cash stacked higher than refrigerators. They didn't just describe his business. They made it sound like a multinational corporation, with Barnes as the CEO. And in many ways, they were right. Witnesses spoke of rules, of discipline, of the council itself. Every word was a dagger. Every detail a piece of a puzzle meant to prove that Harlem's king wasn't untouchable at all. Guy sat quietly, his face composed, his body still. He knew eyes were on him, both inside the courtroom and outside in the streets. For all his calm, the weight of uncertainty pressed against his chest like a stone. He wasn't the star of this trial. That was Barnes. But he was close enough to the center that the fallout could erase him just as easily. Prosecutors whispered his name alongside others, hinting at connections, implying involvement. But implication was not conviction, and that difference would prove to be his lifeline. The witnesses were relentless. Former dealers, associates, and addicts were paraded before the jury. Some spoke out of fear, others out of desperation for lighter sentences. Each one described the machine, the gears grinding, the council pulling strings. Some pointed at Barnes directly, their words sharp with bitterness. Others spoke vaguely of men in sharp suits, men who never touched the drugs themselves but controlled the flow like generals directing an army. The prosecution's picture was clear. Barnes was the head of the snake, and if they couldn't cut off the body entirely, they were determined to sever the head. The defense struck back with equal fire. Barnes's attorneys framed him as a target of obsession, a man pursued more for his reputation than for evidence. They attacked witnesses, exposed inconsistencies, and reminded the jury that the burden of proof lay squarely on the government's shoulders. They argued that image had become more important than facts, that Mr. Untouchable was a nickname, not a confession. And in those moments, Guy listened carefully. He wasn't on trial in name, but his freedom was tethered to the same fragile line of arguments, the same jury weighing the truth against the spectacle. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like vultures. Cameras flashed, headlines screamed, the public devoured every detail. For Harlem, the trial was more than legal proceedings. It was a referendum. Some saw Barnes as a symbol of power, a man who outsmarted the system until it finally caught up with him. Others saw him as the reason addiction ripped through their neighborhoods, the face of destruction cloaked in silk suits. Guy felt that tension every time he walked through the courthouse doors, the stares of strangers heavy with judgment, admiration, or both. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Jurors shifted in their seats, visibly burdened by the weight of the case. They weren't just deciding a man's fate. They were deciding the message it would send. Could anyone truly be untouchable? Could a man rise so high above the law and still walk free? The prosecutors pressed harder, their voices rising with righteous fury, their arguments sharpened like blades. They wanted life without parole. They wanted a symbol. And Barnes, sitting stone-faced, gave them no satisfaction, not a flinch, not a flicker. For Guy, the trial was a masterclass in fragility. He saw how quickly power could be dismantled, how years of discipline and silence could unravel in weeks of testimony. He thought of the rules of the council, the brotherhood sworn to loyalty and discretion. And he saw how easily those rules could be pierced by pressure, by fear, by the promise of leniency whispered to a witness in the back room of a prosecutor's office. The code was strong, but men were weak. That was the lesson he could not ignore. The climax came with the jury's deliberation. Hours stretched into days, tension wound tighter with each passing moment. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom fell into a silence so deep it was almost holy. The foreman stood, papers trembling slightly in his hands, and delivered the words that would echo across Harlem. Guilty. Barnes was convicted on federal narcotics charges. The punishment? Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who called himself untouchable was shackled, his empire shattered by the force of the government's case. For Guy, the outcome was both terrifying and miraculous. On some charges tied to him, the jury could not agree. No unanimous decision. And in the world of the courtroom, a hung jury meant survival. He was not acquitted, not absolved, but he was free, for now. It was a narrow escape, a reminder that fortune can turn on the smallest cracks. One or two jurors holding doubt had kept him from following Barnes into a life sentence. And though relief washed over him, it was tempered by the knowledge that the storm had not passed. It had only shifted. The sentencing was a spectacle in itself. Barnes sat before the judge, expression calm, voice steady, as he was told he would never walk free again. Outside, the press shouted questions, the headlines declared victory, and law enforcement celebrated. For the government, this was more than a conviction. It was proof that no one was beyond their reach. For Harlem, it was a signal that the old order was crumbling. And for the council, it was a wound that could never fully heal. Guy walked away from the courthouse with a second chance burning in his chest. He had seen how close the blade had come, how easily his name could have been buried beside Barnes's. He felt the fragility of his position, the reality that law enforcement was not finished with him. He was still in their sights, still marked by association, still vulnerable. But he was free, and freedom, in that moment, was enough. Yet the shadow of the trial lingered. The council was weakened, its leader imprisoned, its unity shaken. Trust was scarred, suspicion deeper than ever. Some looked at Guy differently, wondering how he had walked free when Barnes had not. Whispers traveled faster than truth in Harlem, and whispers could be as dangerous as bullets. He knew the eyes on him were sharp, questioning, waiting for a misstep, and he also knew that the government, though denied a conviction against him this time, would be patient. They would wait, they would watch, and when the chance came again, they would strike harder. Walking through Harlem after the trial felt different. The streets were the same, bustling, alive, dripping with energy, but the air carried tension. Addicts still staggered through alleys. Hustlers still shouted on corners. But the myth of invincibility was gone. If Barnes could fall, anyone could. And if the government could cage Mr. Untouchable, then no one was safe from their reach. That fear trickled down through the ranks, unsettling dealers, emboldening rivals, fueling paranoia. Guy carried himself as he always had, disciplined, calm, confident. But inside, he wrestled with the truth. He had survived, yes, but survival came with responsibility. The council needed stability, leadership, a steady hand to hold what was left together. And though he was young, though he had barely escaped conviction, many looked to him now. They saw in him the discipline, the restraint, the vision. But with leadership came danger, and with danger came the inevitability of betrayal. He couldn't shake the image of Barnes being led away in chains, the man who once sat at the center of Harlem's empire reduced to another inmate in a prison jumpsuit. That image haunted him, not because he pitied Barnes, but because he knew it could be him. It could be any of them. And the question that burned in his mind was simple but terrifying. How long before the noose tightened again? Because hung juries were not acquittals. They were delays. And delays were only borrowed time. Chapter 9. Dreams Beyond the Streets. The first building he bought wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a tower on Park Avenue, or a sprawling estate in the suburbs. It was a modest property, brick walls weathered, windows clouded with years of neglect. But when Guy Fisher stood in front of it, keys heavy in his palm, he felt something shift. For the first time, he wasn't just a hustler counting cash in the shadows. He was a man holding proof that his money could create more than fear. It could create permanence. After the Barnes trial, Guy's survival wasn't just luck. It was a signal. He had lived through the fire, and now people looked at him differently. Rivals wondered how he managed it. Associates saw resilience. To the streets, he had become a figure with more gravity, someone who could carry Harlem's underworld forward. But Guy didn't want his legacy to be just heroin and hustling. He wanted something tangible, something that couldn't be erased by a jury or an indictment. And so, he began looking beyond the corners, beyond the cut houses, beyond the cash. He began dreaming of the streets as a stepping stone, not a prison. Real estate was his first step. He understood instinctively that property was power in New York. Buildings weren't just bricks and steel. They were anchors, investments that grew over time instead of vanishing overnight. While others spent their profits on cars they could barely keep or jewelry that glittered only under club lights, Guy bought land. He purchased rental properties, put his name, quietly, on deeds, and started planting roots in a city where everything else felt temporary. It was a gamble, yes. Dirty money had to be washed clean. But to Guy, it was worth the risk. Every closing was another step toward legitimacy, another layer of armor against the instability of the drug world. Clubs came next. Harlem nightlife pulsed like a living thing, and Guy wanted to be part of it. Owning a club wasn't just about money. It was about image. A club was a stage, a place where influence walked through the doors wearing suits and sequins, where connections were forged over champagne and whispers. When Guy stepped into his clubs, he didn't carry himself like a hustler checking receipts. He moved like a proprietor, shaking hands, making introductions, blending the underworld with the upper world in ways few men dared. Patrons might not have known the full truth, but they knew one thing. This was his place, his territory, his vision brought to life. In these spaces, Guy thrived. He wasn't just a name in the drug game anymore. He was a businessman, or at least he looked like one. And perception mattered. The same charm that had made him magnetic in Harlem's alleys now made him magnetic in boardrooms and back offices. He dressed sharper, spoke smoother, carried himself with a confidence that hinted at both danger and sophistication. He could sit with hustlers 1 hour and landlords the next, shifting between worlds with ease. That ability was rare. That ability made him dangerous in a different way. The more he invested, the more he imagined a life where he no longer had to look over his shoulder. A life where the council's rules didn't dictate his every move. A life where he could sit in the front row of his own theater and watch the lights come up on a stage filled with music instead of fear. The Apollo was already whispering to him, long before the chance came by it. But for now, the clubs and properties were enough. They were proof that he could straddle both worlds, the one drenched in heroin money and the one draped in legitimacy. But legitimacy came with its own shadows. The government wasn't blind. They knew drug money didn't just vanish. They tracked it, followed it, looked for cracks in the armor. And every building Guy bought, every business he opened, was another question mark on their charts, another thread in the web they were building. For him, these moves were dreams. For them, they were evidence. Evidence that the heroin trade was feeding into something larger, something they could eventually drag into court. Still, Guy pressed forward. He couldn't stop himself. The dream was too strong. He wanted more than respect whispered on street corners. He wanted respect spoken in daylight, in the language of contracts and property deeds. He wanted to prove that men like him could rise above the labels, that hustlers could evolve into legitimate kings. Every investment was a rebellion against the idea that the streets defined him forever. And yet, at night, doubts crept in. He would lie awake, staring at ceilings he now owned, and wonder how much time he had before it all came crashing down. He had seen how quickly power evaporated. Barnes had been untouchable until he wasn't. Empires had been stable until the walls fell in. Guy knew better than to believe his path would be smooth. But he also knew he couldn't stop. Ambition doesn't pause. It drives, it burns, it consumes. And his ambition had outgrown the corners long ago. People around him noticed the change. Some admired it. They saw him as a visionary, someone who understood that the real prize wasn't fast money, but lasting money. Others whispered with suspicion. Was he turning his back on the game? Was he preparing an escape, while others were still knee-deep in the trenches? In the underworld, ambition could inspire or divide, sometimes both at once. And Guy felt the weight of those whispers even as he smiled and signed new contracts. He told himself he was building a safety net, a legacy, something his family could hold on long after the heroin empire dissolved. But deep down, he knew he was walking a tightrope. The higher he climbed into legitimacy, the more visible he became. And visibility was dangerous. The government wasn't the only threat. Rivals watched too. They wondered how a kid from the Bronx had risen so far, how he could move with such ease between drug dens and cocktail parties. Envy is as lethal as law enforcement, and in Harlem, envy carried its own bullets. Still, Guy kept climbing. He expanded, invested, diversified. His clubs thrived, his properties grew, and his name carried weight in more circles than ever. He was no longer just a hustler. He was a figure, a man shaping Harlem not just through the drug trade, but through business, through image, through dreams that reached beyond the streets. But dreams have a way of colliding with reality. And in Guy Fisher's world, reality was unforgiving. Because no matter how many deeds he signed, no matter how many champagne bottles popped in his clubs, the foundation of it all was heroin. Every brick, every bottle, every handshake was tied to the poison flowing through Harlem's veins. And poison has a way of seeping back into everything it touches. One night, standing in one of his clubs as music thumped and lights flashed across a crowd of dancers, Guy caught his reflection in a mirrored wall. He saw himself in a tailored suit, surrounded by laughter and applause, a man who looked like he had left the streets far behind. But behind that reflection, in his mind, he still saw the addicts, the raids, the trials. He saw the storm clouds gathering again, darker this time, heavier. And he wondered how long he could keep balancing on this fragile line. Because dreams built on the streets can rise high, but they carry the weight of where they came from. And sooner or later, That weight demands a price. Chapter 10: Buying the Apollo Theater. The deal went through quietly, but the news thundered across Harlem like an earthquake. The Apollo Theater, Harlem's crown jewel, the stage where legends were born, was no longer just a monument of music and culture. It was now in the hands of Guy Fisher and his partners. For the first time, a man who had built his fortune in the shadows of the drug trade had stepped into the blinding light of legitimacy by owning one of the most iconic venues in America. To the public, it looked like triumph. To law enforcement, it looked like proof. And to Guy, it felt like destiny. The Apollo wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary of black culture, a place where Billie Holiday's voice had once soared, where James Brown's sweat had baptized the stage, where generations came to see their reflection in the spotlight. For Harlem, the Apollo was history written in music and applause. To own it was to hold a piece of the soul of the community. And when Guy Fisher signed his name on those papers, when he stood under that glowing marquee as its new owner, it was more than business. It was validation. The boy from the Patterson houses, the hustler turned council member, now stood as a legitimate businessman commanding respect in daylight. He had imagined this moment for years. While others poured their money into flashy cars and diamond watches, Guy had dreamed of legacy. He wanted something that couldn't be seized in a raid or lost in a courtroom. And now, here it was, the Apollo Theater, the crown jewel of Harlem, his name tied to its revival. He walked through its halls, feeling the history in the worn wood, the echoes of past performances vibrating through the air. He didn't just see a theater. He saw a future, a space where culture and business merged, where he could finally step out of the shadows. But the theater was more than a dream. It was also a statement. In Harlem, ownership was power, and the Apollo had been in decline. It needed saving, it needed money, it needed vision. Guy provided all three. Renovations began, managers were brought in, changes were made to modernize operations. He wasn't just content to hold the deed. He wanted the Apollo to thrive, to become once again the beating heart of Harlem's entertainment scene. Audiences returned. The marquee lit up the block. And for a moment, it felt like Guy Fisher had done what few hustlers had ever managed. He had crossed the invisible line between outlaw and entrepreneur. The pride he felt was matched by the pride of those around him. For many in Harlem, Guy's ownership was symbolic. It was proof that one of their own, a man who had risen from poverty, now controlled a stage that had belonged to outsiders for too long. He stood as an example of what was possible, even if everyone didn't know, or didn't want to know, where the money had come from. Respect poured in, applause followed him, and the theater gleamed with new life. But beneath the applause, shadows lurked. To the government, the Apollo wasn't a triumph. It was evidence. They saw it as the perfect example of drug money being laundered into legitimacy. Every renovation, every ticket sold, every dollar of investment was, in their eyes, tainted. Federal agents circled like wolves, gathering proof, building cases. They didn't see a businessman. They saw a drug lord wearing a suit, trying to scrub the dirt from his empire. And to them, the Apollo was not a redemption story. It was a smoking gun. Guy knew this. He wasn't naive. He understood that every move into legitimacy came with more eyes watching, more questions asked. But he believed the risk was worth it. Owning the Apollo wasn't about hiding money. It was about creating permanence, building something that couldn't be erased with a single conviction. He told himself he was building for the future, for his family, for his community. And yet, the tension remained. Could a theater this iconic, this visible, truly protect him? Or would it become the very thing that brought him down? Inside the council, his bold move caused ripples. Some admired him, saw his vision, understood that he was paving a path none of them had dared to imagine. Others questioned his intentions, whispered that he was leaving the game behind, building an escape hatch while they were still neck-deep in the business. In a world where loyalty was survival, even the perception of betrayal was dangerous. And Guy's ownership of the Apollo, as grand as it was, began to draw suspicion from the very men who once celebrated his discipline. Still, the theater thrived. Night after night, crowds filled its seats, laughter and music spilling into the streets. Guy would sometimes stand in the back, watching performers command the stage, the audience clapping, the air electric. In those moments, he felt something close to peace. He had taken a piece of Harlem's soul and restored it. He had turned the whispers of his ambition into applause that shook the walls. It was everything he had dreamed. But dreams built on foundations of heroin were fragile, and he knew it. Law enforcement wasn't silent. IRS raids came, inspectors prowled, headlines whispered about finances. The government suspected what everyone else chose to ignore, that the Apollo had been bought with blood money, that behind its glowing marquee was a shadow darker than any spotlight could pierce. Investigators traced money, questioned associates, and slowly, the theater that had seemed like salvation began to look more like evidence in a case yet to be filed. Guy carried that tension with him every day. He smiled for cameras, shook hands with business leaders, acted every bit the part of a legitimate entrepreneur. But inside, he felt the pressure mounting. The more legitimate he became, the more vulnerable he was. Because in legitimacy, you couldn't hide. The theater was too visible, too iconic. It was a stage not just for performers, but for scrutiny. And scrutiny, in his world, was lethal. One night, as he locked the theater doors after a show, the streets quiet, he lingered beneath the glowing marquee. The lights bathed him in gold, but he couldn't escape the thought that those same lights were also a spotlight for the government, a target he had painted on himself. He thought of the boy in the Bronx who had once stared at his reflection, hungry for more. He thought of the man who had sat at the council's table, sworn to loyalty and silence. And he thought of the businessman who now owned a piece of Harlem's heart. The three versions of himself collided in that moment. The hustler, the council member, the businessman. Which one would survive? Which one would define him when the end came? Because as much as the Apollo symbolized triumph, it also symbolized exposure. And exposure, in Guy Fisher's world, was a death sentence waiting to be served. Chapter 11. Fame and Trouble. The night the Apollo reopened under Guy Fisher's ownership, the marquee blazed against the Harlem sky like a beacon. Crowds lined up around the block, laughter spilling into the air, the scent of street food mixing with perfume and cigar smoke. Inside, the velvet seats filled, the stage lights warmed, and anticipation rippled through the room. To the community, it felt like a resurrection, the Apollo reborn, a phoenix rising from years of decline. To Guy, standing quietly in the shadows of the balcony, it felt like vindication. He had turned a dream into reality, a hustler's ambition into a businessman's triumph. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that the past couldn't touch him here, that applause could drown out the echoes of the streets. But applause doesn't last forever. And beneath the thunder of clapping hands, trouble was already moving in silence. The Apollo was a dream, yes, but it was also a burden. Running a theater wasn't like running a corner or even a club. It was expensive, demanding, and relentless. Payroll had to be met, taxes had to be filed, debts had to be paid. And the IRS didn't care about Harlem pride or cultural legacy. They care about numbers. When investigators began looking into the theater's books, the numbers didn't add up. Questions piled up about where the money had come from, how it was being managed, and whether the theater itself was a front for laundering drug profits. IRS agents arrived one morning, not with applause, but with badges and warrants. They walked through the Apollo's doors, their presence as heavy as storm clouds, and began combing through records. To the public, it looked like harassment. To law enforcement, it was evidence gathering. And to Guy, it was the first crack in the armor of legitimacy he had built. Debt shadowed the theater too. Reviving the Apollo wasn't cheap, and even with crowds returning, expenses bled faster than profits could fill them. Renovations, staff, performances, all of it cost more than the theater could generate in its fragile comeback. Bills stacked like bricks, interest mounted, and whispers of financial trouble began circulating through Harlem. People started asking the question no owner wanted to hear. Could the Apollo fall again? For Guy, the weight was suffocating. He had worked tirelessly to present himself as legitimate, to stand not just as a council member, but as a businessman, a leader, a symbol. But legitimacy demanded transparency, and transparency was dangerous. Every audit, every inspection, every balance sheet threatened to expose the threads tying his empire back to heroin. He smiled for the cameras, stood tall in public, but behind closed doors, he felt the pressure grinding into him, the same way the walls of a prison cell press inward on a man's spirit. The community was divided. Some still cheered him on, proud that one of their own had taken control of the Apollo. To them, Guy Fisher was proof that Harlem could rise, that its cultural treasures could be preserved by black ownership. Others, however, whispered in alleys and kitchens that the theater's troubles were inevitable, that it had been built on dirty money, and dirty money always carried curses. Respect and suspicion clashed in equal measure, and Guy felt both every time he walked the streets. The government's gaze never left him. To agents, the Apollo wasn't just a theater. It was the centerpiece of a case. They believed it proved what they had suspected all along, that the drug trade wasn't just feeding addiction, it was being used to buy legitimacy. To them, the Apollo wasn't a crown jewel. It was a trophy waiting to be seized. And every dollar that flowed through its box office was another nail in the case they were building. In council meetings, whispers turned sharper. Some saw Guy's venture as brilliance, a bold move that elevated them all. Others saw it as recklessness, a spotlight that risked exposing everything they had worked to protect. Loyalty wavered under the heat of suspicion, and in a brotherhood built on silence, even doubt was dangerous. Guy kept his composure, but inside, he knew the theater that was supposed to shield him might one day be the very blade that cut him down. Still, he refused to give in. He poured energy into keeping the Apollo alive, booking acts, managing renovations, trying to balance the books. He believed that if he could keep it running, if he could keep the lights on and the crowds coming, the dream would survive. But survival was fragile. Every night the lights dimmed. Every time the seats emptied. He felt the weight of debt pressing harder. And each time an IRS letter arrived, each time an agent knocked on his door, the illusion of permanence cracked a little more. There was one night when the crowd roared so loud the walls seemed to shake. Guy stood backstage, listening, his face bathed in the glow of the stage lights. For a fleeting moment, he felt triumph. He had brought joy back to Harlem, resurrected a theater that had once seemed lost. But as the cheers faded, as the night ended, he stepped into the cold Harlem air and saw the government cars parked down the street, their silhouettes waiting, watching. The applause had ended. The trouble remained. Debt, investigations, suspicion. It all gathered like storm clouds over the Apollo. The theater was alive again, yes, but it was fragile, a flower blooming in winter, vulnerable to the frost. Guy carried the dream in his heart, but he also carried the fear that it wouldn't last, that no matter how hard he tried to climb into legitimacy, the streets would drag him back down. And as he looked up at the marquee one night, the letters glowing against the dark sky, he couldn't shake the thought that those lights weren't just shining. They were warning signs, a beacon drawing not just audiences, but predators. Because dreams built in daylight are always hunted by shadows. And in Guy Fisher's world, the shadows never stayed far behind. Chapter 12, Balancing Two Worlds. The pressure came from every direction, squeezing Guy Fisher's life into something sharp and fragile. By day, he wore the mask of legitimacy, shaking hands with city officials, touring properties, signing contract for the Apollo. By night, he slipped back into the shadows, checking shipments, counting stacks of cash, making sure the heroin machine never stalled. It was like living two lives inside one body, and the strain was beginning to show. The duality was intoxicating at first. In the morning, he could walk into the Apollo dressed like a businessman, discussing seating charts and renovations. He could hear the echoes of laughter, the applause of audiences who had no idea about the world he came from. In those moments, he felt free, like the boy from the Bronx had finally outrun the streets. But when the sun went down, reality returned. Calls from couriers, messages from the council, whispers about rivals. Each reminder that his empire was built on foundations darker than any stage light could illuminate. The contrast was stark. The theater was polished wood and velvet curtains. The heroin trade was back rooms and cut houses, the bitter chemical smell of powder filling the air. One was applauded, the other condemned. Yet both fed each other. Without the money from heroin, the Apollo wouldn't exist under his name. Without the Apollo, he had no shield, no legitimacy, nothing to anchor him beyond the streets. It was a cycle, a loop he couldn't escape. And the loop was tightening. The IRS raids were only the beginning. Investigators followed the money, drawing lines on charts that connected clubs, properties, and the theater back to the flow of heroin. Each connection weakened the walls Guy tried to build between his two worlds. He told himself he could keep them separate, that the businessman and the drug lord could coexist without bleeding into one another. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. The money tied everything together. The streets and the stage were linked, whether he admitted it or not. Friends and associates noticed the strain. Some said he looked tired, more distant, as though the weight of keeping the mask in place was draining him. Others said he looked sharper than ever, focused, determined to prove he could hold both worlds in his hands without letting either slip. He smiled when he needed to, charmed when it was required. But inside he wrestled with the truth. The tighter he gripped, the more slippery it became. The council wasn't blind either. Some admired his ambition, seeing him as a visionary, proof that they could evolve into something more than hustlers. Others distrusted it, whispering that he was straying too far, building a kingdom for himself while the Brotherhood still held the weight of the street. Ambition could inspire, but in Harlem's underworld, it could also ignite suspicion. And suspicion, in that circle, was often fatal. Guy knew that suspicion lingered. He felt it in the way eyes lingered on him during meetings, in the pauses between sentences. He knew that to some, the Apollo wasn't a triumph, but a betrayal, a sign that he was preparing to leave them behind. But he couldn't stop. The dream was too powerful. To abandon it would be to admit that he was only what the streets made him, and Guy Fisher wanted more. Balancing the two worlds meant living with constant contradictions. In the same day, he might meet with a city planner in the morning and an enforcer by nightfall. He might talk about lighting systems and acoustics, while knowing that across town, heroin was being cut and bagged under his name. He lived in meetings and in shadows, in applause and in whispers. It was a performance, and like any performance, it required stamina. But even the best actors eventually falter. At night, when he was alone, the questions clawed at him. Could he ever fully escape one world while living in the other? Could legitimacy ever erase the blood and the poison that had paid for it? Could the Apollo truly protect him, or was it simply a spotlight drawing the government closer? He didn't have answers, only instincts. And his instincts told him the walls were closing in. The government kept circling. Agents built files thicker by the day, their charts filling with names and dates. The more visible he became in business, the easier he was to track in the underworld. Every deal, every investment, every handshake was another thread in a web. And webs don't break easily. They tighten, slowly, until the prey has no way out. Guy knew this. He had seen it happen to others, watched as men, just as powerful, were brought down by the weight of evidence. The question wasn't if, it was when. But ambition has a way of silencing fear. He pushed forward, even as the signs grew darker. He doubled down on the Apollo, poured more into properties, made himself more visible. He believed that if he could build enough, fast enough, he could outrun the consequences. That if he climbed high enough, the law couldn't pull him back down. It was a gamble, the same kind he had been making since he first stepped into Harlem streets. And like every gamble, the odds grew worse the longer you played. One evening, After a day spent juggling theater finances and a night spent smoothing over council disputes, Guy stepped outside into the Harlem night. The city buzzed with energy, but he felt strangely alone. The neon lights glowed, cars hummed, voices carried through the air, but all he heard was the echo of his own thoughts. He looked up at the Apollo's marquee, its glow washing over him, and felt the contradiction crash against him. He was both a king and a prisoner, celebrated and hunted, legitimate and outlaw. The dual life had made him powerful, yes, but it had also made him vulnerable. Because in the end, balancing two worlds meant belonging fully to neither, and belonging to neither meant being at risk in both. As the night deepened and the city pulsed around him, Guy Fisher knew the walls between his two lives were thinning. And once those walls collapsed, there would be no separation left. Only the truth and the consequences waiting behind it. Chapter 13. The Fatal Rumor. It began as a whisper, the kind of whisper that drifts through Harlem like smoke, invisible at first, then suffocating once it fills the room. A rumor, quiet, sharp, and dangerous. The kind of rumor that didn't just wound reputations. It killed. Word spread that Guy Fisher, the youngest of the council, the man who had built a name on discipline and restraint, had crossed the one line no brother was allowed to cross. That he was involved with the woman who had once belonged to Nicky Barnes. At first, Guy brushed it off. In Harlem, whispers came cheap. Rivals spread lies. Jealous men invented stories. Enemies looked for cracks to exploit. But this wasn't just any whisper. This was a direct violation of the code, one of the sacred rules of the council. Never touch another man's wife or mistress. It wasn't about romance or jealousy. It was about trust. A brotherhood built on loyalty could not survive betrayal that personal. And if there was even a hint of truth, the consequences would be brutal. The streets ate up the story. Dealers repeated it in hushed voices. Women leaned closer to hear the details. Men nodded knowingly, even if they knew nothing at all. That's how rumors work. They don't need proof. They just need repetition. And with every retelling, the story grew sharper, heavier, more dangerous. It became less of a question and more of an accusation. Barnes himself was in prison when he first heard it. Locked away, stripped of his empire, he still carried pride like armor. And that pride twisted into rage when the rumor reached his ears. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In his mind, the code had been broken. He had built the council on discipline, demanded loyalty above all else, and now, from behind bars, he was being mocked. The man he had once mentored, the young hustler he had lifted into power, had violated the one rule that cut deepest. For Barnes, betrayal was oxygen to his fury. He replayed it in his mind, letting it fester, letting it grow. Anger has a way of sharpening memory, and he began to focus not on the brotherhood they had shared, not on the empire they had built, but on the humiliation. To be betrayed in the streets was one thing. To be betrayed in love, real or imagined, was unforgivable. Guy, meanwhile, kept moving. He ran businesses, managed the Apollo, kept the heroin machine alive. He carried himself with the same calm confidence, but inside he felt the ground shifting beneath him. He knew the rumor was more than idle talk. It had reached Barnes. It had reached the council. And once it reached the council, it was no longer a story, it was a charge. In their meetings, silence grew heavier. Men who once greeted him with easy nods now studied him with lingering eyes. Conversations stopped when he walked into the room. The code didn't require proof. It required perception, and perception was tilting against him. He explained nothing, defended nothing, perhaps hoping that silence would protect him, that discipline would prevail. But discipline can't silence suspicion once it takes root. It spreads like a crack in glass, splintering until the whole structure is ready to shatter. The irony was cruel. For years, Guy had thrived because he embodied the rules. He was disciplined, loyal, calm under pressure. He had risen because he never gave in to recklessness. And now, the very rule that anchored the council, the very code that gave him strength, had turned into a blade pointed at his throat. Law enforcement watched all of this unfold with fascination. They knew the council was built on strict codes, and they understood that betrayal within was as dangerous as pressure from outside. A rumor like this could fracture loyalties, open cracks, make men vulnerable to deals and bargains. To agents, it wasn't just gossip, it was opportunity. And they were patient, waiting to see how the Brotherhood would respond. Barnes's rage grew into something darker. He was a king dethroned, a man stripped of his empire, but still hungry for influence. And when the government approached him with a deal, he listened. They wanted testimony. They wanted names. They wanted the council dismantled. And Barnes, fueled by the bitterness of betrayal, was ready to give it to them. The rumor had turned him, had transformed him from untouchable kingpin into government informant. And the first name he offered, the first target of his fury, was Guy Fisher. Guy couldn't have known how deep the damage was. He couldn't have known that in prison, a man he once called brother was sharpening a knife that would end his empire. But he felt the pressure closing in. The rumor wasn't dying. It was alive, gnawing at the council, feeding suspicion, and setting the stage for what was to come. In quiet moments, Guy thought of the irony. He had spent years balancing two worlds, building legitimacy, dreaming of permanence. And yet, it wasn't the government's evidence or the street's violence that would undo him. It was a whisper, a fatal rumor, a story carried on the wind, unprovable, unstoppable, but powerful enough to fracture loyalty and ignite betrayal. Late one night, as he left the Apollo, he paused beneath the marquee, the glow spilling over his face. The lights felt different now, not triumphant, not protective, but heavy, exposing him. He thought of the council's code, of the rules etched into their brotherhood, and how fragile they truly were. One broken rule could erase years of discipline. One rumor could erase everything. And as he walked into the Harlem night, the city alive but ominous, Guy Fisher knew that something had shifted forever. The council was no longer united. Barnes was no longer silent. And the whisper had grown into a storm that would soon consume them all. Chapter 14. Barnes turns informant. The moment the decision was made, the underworld shifted on its axis. In a sterile prison office, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, the man who once called himself untouchable leaned forward and did the unthinkable. He agreed to talk. Nicky Barnes, Harlem's kingpin, the architect of the council, the man who had built his legend on silence and discipline, became something else entirely. He became an informant. The bitterness had been growing for years. Locked away for life, watching his empire erode, Barnes felt every ounce of pride curdle into rage. He had been the leader, the strategist, the face of Harlem's heroin machine, and yet here he sat, powerless, caged. Prison does strange things to men. It strips them down, leaves them with nothing but time and memory. And memory, when laced with betrayal, becomes a poison. The rumor that Guy Fisher had crossed the line with his mistress was that poison. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered. To Barnes, it was betrayal made flesh. And betrayal demanded revenge. When federal prosecutors first approached him, they weren't sure how far he'd go. He had been their enemy for so long, his name a symbol of defiance. But they sensed weakness, the same way hunters sense when prey is wounded. They offered him a deal, not freedom, but power. Power to strike back. Power to dismantle the very brotherhood he had created. Barnes listened, eyes sharp, heart burning. And then he began to talk. What he gave them was more than information. It was architecture. He laid out the council like blueprints, describing its members, its rules, its operations. He named names, connected dots, filled gaps in investigations that agents had been chasing for years. For prosecutors, it was a gold mine. For the council, it was a death sentence. Silence had once been their shield. Now, their own leader was breaking it apart word by word. Barnes didn't just talk about business. He talked about people. He described who could be trusted, who couldn't, who was loyal, who had ambitions that stretched too far. And through it all, one name rose above the rest, Guy Fisher. The bitterness in Barnes's voice when he spoke of him was unmistakable. It wasn't just about the Apollo, or the money, or even the heroin. It was personal. To him, Guy wasn't just another member of the council. He was the man who had broken the code, the man who had humiliated him from inside his cell. And so, Guy became the centerpiece of Barnes's revenge. The government knew the value of this gift. They had spent years chasing shadows, building cases that always seemed to slip through their fingers. Now they had something solid, something undeniable. They had the inside story, straight from the man who had built the empire. It was like being handed the keys to a vault they could never crack. And inside that vault was the destruction of Harlem's ruling syndicate. But cooperation came at a cost. To become an informant was to become a ghost. Barnes knew that once word got out, he would never again walk the streets without a target on his back. Informants weren't just hated. They were erased, their names spat with venom, their faces cursed. In the underworld, to flip was to cease being a man. But Barnes was already caged, his legend already crumbling. To him, reputation no longer mattered. Revenge did. The whispers spread quickly. Prison walls couldn't contain the news. Soon Harlem knew, the council knew, the streets knew. Nicky Barnes was talking. Men who once invoked his name with reverence now spoke it with disgust. And in the center of it all, Guy Fisher felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had survived trials, raids, deaths, and whispers. But this was different. This was the kind of betrayal that no discipline could shield against. When the architect himself starts dismantling the house, there's nowhere left to hide. Inside federal offices, agents leaned over transcripts, their pens scratching furiously, their smiles hidden but undeniable. For them, this was the break they had been waiting for. Every sentence out of Barnes's mouth was another nail in the council's coffin, another step closer to indictments, trials, and convictions. They didn't need to chase shadows anymore. The shadows were talking. For Guy, the irony was sharp. He had lived by the code, respected its rules, built his reputation on discipline. And yet, here he was, betrayed by the very man who had taught him those rules. Betrayal had always been the thing they feared most, the one sin that demanded blood. And now, betrayal was leading the council straight into the hands of the government. The Apollo's lights still glowed, audiences still clapped, but the applause was hollow. Behind the scenes, agents traced money, collected testimony, built cases stronger than ever. Every night, Guy stood beneath the marquee, smiling for crowds. He knew prosecutors were sharpening their knives, armed with Barnes's words. The theater that had once been his dream now felt like a stage set for his downfall. In council meetings, suspicion grew like a disease. Who knew what? Who had said what? If Barnes was talking, how much had he already given away? Trust evaporated, replaced by paranoia. Brothers who once swore loyalty now watched each other with narrowed eyes. The code that once held them together had been shattered, not by outsiders, but by the man who had written it. And when the foundation cracks, the entire structure trembles. Barnes's decision wasn't just betrayal. It was an execution. One by one, the men of the council would feel its reach, dragged into courtrooms, shackled, sentenced. And at the heart of it all, Guy Fisher loomed largest. He had become the target, the symbol, the story prosecutors wanted to tell. The drug lord who bought the Apollo Theater, the man who tried to straddle two worlds, now brought down by the fury of his own mentor. Late at night, in the quiet of his own thoughts, Guy must have replayed it over and over. The moments of loyalty, the handshakes, the rules spoken like gospel. And now, the silence of those rules replaced by the voice of betrayal, echoing in courtrooms and offices, erasing everything they had built. It wasn't just the law closing in. It was history turning against him. Because in the underworld, there is no greater crime than betrayal. And when Nicky Barnes turned informant, he didn't just betray the council. He betrayed the very myth of being untouchable. He proved that even kings can fall. And as the government prepared its next move, Guy Fisher stood in the glow of the Apollo's lights, knowing that his time in the spotlight was almost over. Chapter 15, The Indictment. The morning the indictments were unsealed, the city felt like it had been split open. Headlines screamed across front pages. Names that once carried whispers in Harlem, now printed in bold ink for the entire country to see. It wasn't just one man or two. It was the council. The syndicate once built on silence and discipline, now dragged into the light by a sweeping federal case. And there, among the names, was Guy Fisher. The charge was RICO, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations. A law designed to crush the mafia, now turned toward Harlem's heroin empire. It wasn't about a single drug bust or a handful of dealers caught on corners. It was about painting the entire enterprise as a criminal corporation. Every meeting, every handshake, every dollar was presented as part of a larger conspiracy. RICO didn't just attack individuals. It attacked the structure itself. And once the structure was targeted, no one inside it could claim safety. For years, prosecutors had struggled to bring down drug lords who never touched the product themselves. Men like Guy Fisher, who managed from the top, stayed distant from the street-level dirt. RICO changed that. With it, prosecutors didn't need to prove that Guy personally sold heroin on a corner. They just needed to show he was part of the organization. Under RICO, leadership meant liability. The higher you sat, the harder the fall. When the news broke, Harlem buzzed with a mix of shock and inevitability. Some shook their heads in disbelief. How could men who once seemed untouchable now be so vulnerable? Others said they saw it coming all along. They had watched the trials, heard the whispers, seen the pressure mount. The Apollo, once a symbol of pride, now became a symbol of exposure. To many, it looked less like a theater and more like evidence with a marquee. For Guy, the moment must have felt like a surreal nightmare. He had spent years building a life in two worlds, the outlaw and the businessman, the council member and the theater owner. Now, both worlds were colliding in the worst way. Court papers listed his name, alongside those of men he had once called brothers. The accusations stretched across years, describing a criminal enterprise that had infected Harlem from top to bottom. It wasn't just about heroin anymore. It was about conspiracy, laundering, racketeering. The government wasn't interested in small victories. They wanted the entire machine dismantled. Inside federal offices, prosecutors laid out their case like generals preparing for war. They had testimony from witnesses, bank records, surveillance, and most damning of all, the cooperation of Nicky Barnes. His betrayal had given them the skeleton. Now, they were adding flesh to it. They painted the council as a board of directors, a ruling body that controlled heroin with corporate precision. And they made sure the jury would understand that Guy Fisher was not just another name. He was a central figure, a man who had risen high and flaunted it with his ownership of the Apollo. The Apollo, once his shield, was now a spotlight. Prosecutors argued that it was bought with dirty money, maintained with drug profits, and used to launder millions. Every renovation invoice, every receipt, every contract was scrutinized, not as business, but as evidence. To them, it was proof of arrogance, proof that the council thought they could hide in plain sight. And nothing infuriates prosecutors more than arrogance. Guy tried to steady himself. He had always been disciplined, calm, deliberate. But indictments don't care about discipline. They come with the weight of the government, with agents ready to swarm, with headlines ready to crucify. He had survived a hung jury once, but this was different. This wasn't a single trial. This was a sweeping assault, and the odds of slipping through twice were slim. The community reacted with complicated emotions. Some mourned, seeing the fall of men who had once been symbols of power and pride. Others felt relief, believing justice was finally catching up to those who had profited while addiction ravaged Harlem. And some remained conflicted, respecting Guy for his investments in the neighborhood, even as they condemned the poison that had funded them. In Harlem, nothing was simple. Admiration and resentment walked hand in hand. As the indictments turned into arrests, the weight grew heavier. Courthouses buzzed, defense lawyers assembled, families wept. The council, once united by rules and codes, now faced the same enemy, but stood fractured and vulnerable. Suspicion lingered in every glance. Who might flip next? Who might cut a deal? Trust, once their strongest weapon, had become their greatest weakness. For Guy, the walls were closing in. He had always believed he could balance two worlds, that he could hold the outlaw and the entrepreneur in harmony. But Rico didn't allow balance. It erased the lines, forcing both worlds into one story. A criminal enterprise dressed in legitimacy. The Apollo wasn't a dream anymore. It was a piece of the indictment, a theater turned into a stage where his life would be judged. Late one night, after reading through the charges laid against him, Guy must have felt the same chill that Barnes once felt, the realization that no one is untouchable, that no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how disciplined you remain, the law has patience. It waits, it gathers, and when it strikes with the weight of inevitability. In his heart, he must have replayed the path that brought him here. The boy from the Bronx, the hustler in Harlem, the youngest member of the council, the man who dared to own the Apollo. Each step had lifted him higher, but each step had also tied him tighter to the very machine now dragging him down. It wasn't just an indictment. It was destiny, the conclusion of choices made long ago. And yet, even as he prepared for the courtroom battles ahead, there was one thought he couldn't escape. Rico didn't just aim to punish. It aimed to erase. It was designed to dismantle the very idea of the council, to reduce their legacy to ashes. And if the prosecutors had their way, Guy Fisher would not just be convicted. He would be remembered as the man who tried to walk two worlds and lost them both. The Apollo's lights still glowed, but beneath their shine, the shadows deepened. The stage was no longer for performers. It was for prosecutors. Chapter 16, Pre-Trial Maneuvers. The courtroom hadn't even opened for trial, but the battle had already begun. In dim offices with blinds half drawn, in conference rooms stacked with files, lawyers sharpened their weapons. Each motion, each filing, each argument was a strike in the shadow war before the main event. And at the center of it all sat Guy Fisher, watching as the walls of law and order closed around him, brick by brick. The government had spent years building this case, and now they moved with the confidence of predators who had already tasted blood. Their evidence wasn't scattered anymore. It was layered, organized, woven into a story designed to destroy. They had financial records, wiretaps, testimony from witnesses whose faces had once been familiar. They had the cooperation of Nicky Barnes, the betrayal that turned silence into a flood of words. And they had Rico, the law that transformed whispers into chains. For the prosecutors, the strategy was clear. Don't just prove Fisher touched the drug trade. Prove he was the embodiment of it. Every apartment deed, every club, every ticket stub from the Apollo would be linked back to heroin. They wanted to strip away the illusion of legitimacy, to show the jury that the businessman was only ever a mask. In their narrative, the Apollo wasn't a cultural revival. It was a laundering machine, a theater of lies. Fisher's lawyers fought back with every tool they had. They filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming illegal searches, questioning the credibility of informants. They attacked Barnes's cooperation, painting him as a bitter man seeking revenge, a liar who would say anything for leniency. They argued that the government's story was too neat, too convenient, built on the word of a traitor and the paranoia of agents who had hunted the council for years. The motions piled high, each one an attempt to carve holes in the government's case. Suppress this document. Exclude that testimony. Question the chain of custody. It was a chess game played at high stakes, every move calculated, every counter designed to buy time or weaken the blow. But behind closed doors, even the defense team knew the odds were grim. The evidence was heavy, the government relentless. They weren't just chasing a conviction, they were chasing history. For Guy, the pretrial months were suffocating. He sat in meetings with his lawyers, listening to strategies, nodding at arguments, but inside he felt the noose tightening. Each new piece of evidence was another thread pulling him closer to the inevitable. The prosecutor spoke of him not as a man, but as a symbol, the council's youngest star, the drug lord who dared to own the Apollo. He wasn't just on trial for his actions. He was on trial for what he represented. He tried to hold on to discipline, to the calm that had carried him this far. He told himself he had survived once before, that juries could be unpredictable, that cracks could open in even the strongest case. But discipline doesn't silence fear. At night, when the noise of strategy faded, he thought of the cell that could be waiting, of the theater lights that might never glow for him again. He thought of the boy he once was, standing hungry in the Bronx, and wondered if all his ambition had only led him back into chains. The government, meanwhile, pressed harder. They leaked details to the press, shaping public opinion before the jury was even selected. Articles painted Fisher as a kingpin hiding behind culture, a man who had bought Harlem's crown jewel with blood money. Each headline chipped away at the image he had tried to build, erasing the businessman and amplifying the outlaw. For a jury pool drawn from that same city, the effect was powerful. They wouldn't just be judging a man. They'd be judging a story they had already read. Inside the council, the fractures deepened. With indictments looming over them all, trust vanished. Men whispered about deals, about who might flip next. The code that once held them together had been shredded by Barnes's betrayal, and now paranoia ruled. Fisher, once admired for his vision, now stood as a target of suspicion. If the government could paint him as the symbol, maybe others could shift the blame, save themselves. In a brotherhood built on silence, fear had made everyone talk louder than ever. Fisher's lawyers pushed for delays, hoping time might weaken the government's case. But time was a double-edged sword. With every passing month, prosecutors dug deeper, found more, connected dots Fisher hadn't even considered. Bank statements resurfaced. Witnesses were persuaded. Surveillance tapes were unearthed. It was like watching a net being woven tighter and tighter, each thread invisible until it was too late to escape. The legal motions became more desperate. Challenges to RICO itself, arguments that the law was being stretched beyond its intent, claims that the Apollo was a legitimate business unfairly smeared by association. Every motion denied was another reminder that the ground beneath him was crumbling. The courtroom hadn't even opened, but already the scales tilted against him. And yet, Fisher refused to show weakness. In public, he carried himself with the same calm confidence, walking into court appearances in sharp suits, shoulders squared. He smiled for cameras, shook hands with supporters, projected the image of a man in control. But behind those eyes was the quiet dread of a man who knew control was slipping away. The pressure of balancing two worlds was finally collapsing into one, and that one was a courtroom. The prosecutors sharpened their narrative like a blade. They would tell the jury that Fisher was not a victim of circumstance, not a businessman unfairly targeted, but a drug lord who thought he could outsmart the law. They would show the Apollo as his greatest arrogance, proof that he believed he could stand in the spotlight without being burned. They would use his own ambition against him, turning his dream into the centerpiece of their case. Every meeting with his lawyers circled back to the same question. Could they convince a jury to doubt? Doubt the government's evidence, doubt Barnes's testimony, doubt the neatness of the story being told. They didn't need to prove innocence. They just needed to fracture certainty. But certainty was exactly what the government had spent years building, and they had Barnes's voice to cement it. As the pretrial motions wound down, as the date drew closer, Fisher must have felt the inevitability pressing in. He had built an empire on discipline, but discipline cannot rewrite evidence. He had dreamed of legitimacy, but legitimacy could not erase origins. He had once believed he could balance two worlds, but now both worlds were collapsing into one cage. On the eve of trial, he sat in silence, perhaps thinking of the Apollo's lights, of the applause that had once filled its seats. He had wanted to be remembered as more than a hustler, as more than a drug lord. He had wanted to be remembered as a builder, a visionary, a man who gave Harlem back its crown jewel. But the government was preparing to make sure history remembered him differently. The courtroom doors were about to open. The jury would soon be seated, and Guy Fisher's fate would no longer be in his hands. Chapter 17, Barnes on the Stand. The courtroom doors opened, and silence followed him in. Shackled, escorted by marshals, Dressed in prison browns, Nicky Barnes walked to the witness stand. For years, his very name had been enough to silence a room in Harlem, to command respect without raising his voice. Now, in a twist that no one in the underworld could have imagined, that same name carried poison. He wasn't there as a defendant. He was there as a witness for the government. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready. Prosecutors adjusted their files, their faces betraying quiet satisfaction. For them, this was the moment. Their star witness, the architect of the council, the man who had once called himself untouchable, now turning his voice against the very empire he created. It wasn't just testimony. It was spectacle. Guy Fisher sat at the defense table, his face still, his eyes locked on the man who had once been his mentor. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, but inside, the weight pressed heavy. To see Barnes on that stand was to watch the foundation of everything he had built crumble in real time. The code that once bound them together had been shattered beyond repair. Silence had been the rule, and now silence was broken. The prosecutor began slowly, methodically. Questions painted the picture of the council's creation, its rules, its structure. Barnes spoke with calm precision, describing meetings, agreements, and operations as if he were reciting a manual. He explained the code: loyalty, secrecy, discipline. And then, without hesitation, he described how Guy Fisher had been elevated, how he had been trusted, how he had risen to prominence. Each word pulled Fisher deeper into the government story. The betrayal was not just in the facts. It was in the tone. Barnes spoke with bitterness, his voice laced with the sting of personal vengeance. He didn't just describe Fisher as a member of the council. He painted him as ambitious, as reckless, as someone who had broken the code in ways too personal to forgive. The rumor of the mistress hung heavy in the air, unspoken by prosecutors, but present in every syllable of venom that rolled off his tongue. The defense tried to fight back. Cross-examination hammered at his credibility. They reminded the jury that Barnes was serving life without parole, that he had every incentive to say what the government wanted. They painted him as a liar, a bitter man seeking revenge. They asked why the jury should believe a man who had spent his life breaking laws and building lies. But the damage had been done. The spectacle itself carried weight. To see Barnes testifying, to hear him describe the council from the inside, was enough to shatter the myth of invincibility. Reporters scribbled furiously, headlines forming before the day was over. Mr. Untouchable speaks. Council betrayed from within. The image of Barnes on the stand would travel far beyond the courtroom, into living rooms across the country, into Harlem streets where his name was once untouchable. For the government, it was victory. For the council, it was annihilation. Guy sat in silence, his expression controlled, but inside he must have felt the knife twisting. Barnes wasn't just any witness. He was the one who had brought him in, who had given him a seat at the table, who had once been his mentor. And now, that same man was dismantling his life, one answer at a time. Betrayal doesn't always come with a bullet. Sometimes it comes with a calm voice, a raised hand, and sworn testimony. The jury watched closely. They weren't just hearing facts. They were watching a drama unfold. To them, this wasn't a faceless case about drugs and money. It was a story of loyalty, betrayal, and revenge. Prosecutors knew it. They leaned into it, framing Barnes not just as a witness, but as a man confessing his own sins while exposing those of others. It was a narrative too compelling to ignore. The defense fought harder, trying to undermine him, but every denial sounded thin against the weight of his insider knowledge. Barnes didn't waver. He spoke of distribution routes, of meetings in dimly lit rooms, of rules enforced with fear. He described Fisher's investments, his ownership of the Apollo, his attempts to move into legitimacy. To prosecutors, those investments weren't dreams. They were evidence, money cleaned through culture, proof of arrogance. And Barnes's words stitched it all together. Outside the courthouse, Harlem wrestled with the news. Some shook their heads in disgust. How could Barnes betray his own? Others felt a grim satisfaction. Justice, they said, was finally catching up. And still others were stunned silent, unable to reconcile the man who had once symbolized power with the image of him sitting in a courtroom, testifying for the government. It was a moment that fractured the community as much as it fractured the council. For Guy, the betrayal was more than legal. It was personal. He had lived by discipline, by the code, by loyalty. And now, loyalty had turned into a weapon aimed at him. He had dreamed of building something lasting, but in this courtroom, his legacy was being rewritten by the very man who had once believed in him. He had spent his life navigating the shadows, balancing two worlds. But in this moment, there was no balance. There was only exposure. As the testimony stretched on, the noose tightened. Each detail added weight. Each recollection built the narrative prosecutors wanted the jury to believe. Fisher wasn't just a businessman with questionable ties. He was a central figure in a criminal organization, confirmed by the words of its architect. The Apollo wasn't just a theater. It was a monument built on heroin. And Fisher wasn't just unlucky. He was guilty. That was the story being told, and Barnes was the storyteller. When the day ended and Barnes stepped down from the stand, the damage was irreversible. The myth of silence was gone. The council was no longer untouchable. And Guy Fisher's fate had shifted dramatically closer to conviction. Late that night, as Fisher sat in his cell awaiting the next day of trial, he must have replayed it all in his head. The rise, the discipline, the dreams, the Apollo. And now, the betrayal. The man who had once given him power had stripped it away, not with a gun, but with testimony. And he knew, with chilling clarity, that the jury had heard it too. Because betrayal doesn't just sting. It leaves scars that even verdicts cannot erase. And as the trial moved forward, one question loomed heavy in the air. If Barnes could break, if the untouchable could talk, then what chance did anyone else have of surviving the storm? Chapter 18, Verdict of Guilt. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces set in grim lines, their steps heavy with the weight of weeks of testimony. The air was thick, silent, but vibrating with tension, as if everyone inside already knew that history was about to turn. In the front row of the gallery, reporters gripped their notepads. Families leaned forward, hearts caught in throats. And at the defense table, Guy Fisher sat still, hands folded, eyes locked on the jury box. It was May of 1984, and his life was about to be rewritten. The judge's voice broke the silence, calling the foreman forward. In that moment, time slowed. The scrape of the chair, the shuffle of papers, the sound of a throat clearing. Each small detail cut through the room like thunder. Everyone waited for the words that would decide whether Fisher's dream of legitimacy would survive, or whether it would collapse under the weight of the past. The foreman read the verdict. Guilty. RICO. Guilty. Continuing criminal enterprise. Guilty on charges that tied him not just to drugs, but to the very structure of an organization painted as a criminal empire. Each word landed like a hammer. Guilty. 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 Gasps rippled across the room. Some bowed their heads. Others nodded grimly. But for Guy, the sound of those words was both final and surreal. He had braced himself for this, told himself to prepare for the worst. But hearing it aloud was different. It wasn't just a legal decision. It was the end of the illusion, the collapse of two worlds he had tried so desperately to keep separate. The outlaw and the businessman had been judged as one, and the judgment was guilty. Prosecutors sat back, satisfied. Their months of preparation, their reliance on Nicky Barnes's testimony, their weaving together of evidence and narrative, it had all worked. The government had not only won a conviction, they had dismantled the myth of the council, proved that Harlem's syndicate could be broken. The same RICO law that had been designed to crush the mafia had now claimed another empire. And for prosecutors, the victory was more than legal. It was symbolic. No one, not even the man who owned the Apollo Theater, was beyond their reach. The defense slumped, their motions and arguments, their attempts to discredit witnesses, all swept aside by the jury's decision. They had fought to create doubt, to fracture certainty, but certainty had won. The evidence had been too heavy, the betrayal too sharp, the story too compelling. And now, their client faced decades behind bars, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. For Guy, the verdict carried a cruel irony. He had dreamed of building something lasting, something that would outlive the streets. He had believed the Apollo could be his shield, his redemption. But in the end, the theater had become a centerpiece of the case against him, the shining symbol prosecutors pointed to as arrogance, as proof that his empire was nothing more than heroin dressed in velvet and lights. His greatest achievement had become part of the evidence that condemned him. The community reacted with mixed emotions. Some felt pride that the government had finally struck at the heart of the heroin trade, that men who had profited from addiction were facing justice. Others felt sorrow, believing that Fisher had represented more than drugs, that he had been a builder, a man who tried to invest in Harlem when few others would. In barbershops and street corners, people argued, their voices carrying both anger and sadness. But everyone knew one truth. The dream of legitimacy had ended in shackles. The sentencing loomed ahead, but the verdict itself was already a sentence of another kind. Fisher's reputation, once carefully cultivated as disciplined and visionary, was now branded with guilt. To the public, he wasn't a businessman who happened to have a past. He was a drug lord, convicted and caged. The Apollo, the properties, the clubs, all of it was tainted, all of it linked in the jury's eyes to the poison that had flowed through Harlem's veins. Inside, Fisher must have wrestled with regret. He had played both worlds too long, believing he could balance them without falling. But the law had no interest in balance. It demanded judgment. He thought of the boy from the Bronx, the man who once walked into Harlem with charm and ambition, the leader who sat at the council's table, the businessman who bought the Apollo. All those identities had collided in the courtroom, and the collision left only one: guilty. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Headlines splashed across the city by nightfall. Apollo owner convicted. Council member found guilty in RICO case. The public devoured the spectacle, the story of a man who had risen so high only to be pulled down by the weight of his own choices. To the outside world, it was dramatic. To Fisher, it was devastating. The verdict also marked the death of the council. What had once been a brotherhood united by code and discipline was now reduced to fragments. Barnes's betrayal had cracked it. The government's case had shattered it. And the verdict hammered the last nail into its coffin. The council wasn't just weakened. It was gone. Its members, once untouchable, were now numbers in a prison system, their legacy rewritten as criminals rather than rulers. As Fisher was led out of the courtroom, shackled, escorted by marshals, the applause of the Apollo felt like a lifetime ago. The glow of the marquee seemed distant, unreachable. The path he had walked from the projects to the theater, from hustler to businessman, had ended not in applause, but in chains. And yet, even as he walked, his shoulders straight, his face calm, there was something in his eyes. A question, unspoken but sharp. Had it all been worth it? Because guilt is more than a verdict. It is a shadow that follows, a label that cannot be erased. And for Guy Fisher, the verdict of 1984 was not just about punishment. It was about erasure. Erasure of the dream, of the discipline, of the ambition that once set him apart. The courtroom emptied, the headlines were printed, the prosecutors celebrated. But outside, in the streets of Harlem, people still argued. Was he a villain, profiting from destruction? Or was he a man who dared to dream bigger, who stumbled because the world offered him no clean path forward? The verdict said guilty, but the debate would linger long after the gavel fell. And as night fell over Harlem, the Apollo's lights still glowed, casting their familiar shine over 125th Street. But for the man who once owned it, those lights now represented something else. Not triumph, not legacy, but a reminder of how far he had risen and how far he had fallen. Because the verdict may have been read in a courtroom, but the echo of those words, guilty, 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 would follow Guy Fisher for the rest of his life. Chapter 19. Life Without Parole. The day of sentencing carried a stillness heavier than the trial itself. The verdict had already been delivered, the word guilty repeated until it felt like a drumbeat inside Guy Fisher's chest. But sentencing, that was where judgment turned into time, where the future wasn't just threatened, it was sealed. In the packed federal courtroom, eyes fixed on the man who had once been both Harlem's prodigy and Harlem's pariah. He sat at the defense table, 36 years old, dressed in a suit that hung differently now, not with the pride of a businessman, but with the weight of a condemned man. His lawyers spoke, their voices measured, urging the judge for mercy, pointing to Fisher's investments in Harlem, his efforts to restore the Apollo, his education, his discipline. They argued that he was more than the crimes, that his life contained value beyond the verdict. But mercy is rare in federal court, especially in the era of the drug wars, when prosecutors built careers on sending messages. And the message they wanted to send with Guy Fisher was clear: no one is untouchable. The prosecutor's voice cut sharp, describing him as a leader of a criminal enterprise, a man who poisoned communities while pretending to save them. They highlighted the Apollo, not as redemption, but as arrogance, the ultimate symbol of dirty money polished to shine. They spoke of addicts in Harlem's hallways, of families torn apart, of the council's iron grip on heroin. To them, Fisher wasn't a businessman who stumbled. He was an architect of destruction, and his punishment needed to match the scale of his crimes. The judge listened, stone-faced, as the arguments echoed off the courtroom walls. Years of work, years of ambition, years of choices were being distilled into numbers that would decide how much life Guy Fisher had left outside prison walls. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell into silence, so sharp, it seemed even the air had stopped moving. Life without parole. Additional years stacked on top. Fines that reached into millions. Symbolic punishments designed to strip him of wealth and future alike. Life meant exactly that. He would never walk free again, never watch the Apollo's marquee glow as his own, never sit in the audience he once dreamed of serving. At 36, his story was sealed behind bars. For a moment, he didn't move. The words hung there, echoing, too heavy to sink in all at once. Around him, murmurs rose, gasps carried through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. But Guy sat still, his eyes forward, his expression calm. Calmness had been his armor, his discipline, the way he had survived the streets and the courtroom alike. Even now, facing the end, he refused to break. But inside, the weight of life without parole pressed against him like an iron door slamming shut. The irony was cruel. He had spent his life climbing out of the Bronx projects, building discipline where chaos lived, reaching for legitimacy through real estate, through clubs, through the Apollo. He had believed ambition could lift him out, that respectability could erase the shadows. But the same Apollo that had once been his crown was now described as his downfall, the stage upon which prosecutors proved their case. He had tried to write his legacy in applause and culture. The government rewrote it in indictments and sentencing orders. In Harlem, the news landed like thunder. Some cheered. Justice, they said, had finally caught up. Others mourned, believing that Fisher had been more complex than the government allowed, a man who had at least tried to give back, even as he profited. For many, it was a paradox, a builder and a destroyer, a visionary and a criminal. The sentence didn't settle the debate. It only froze him in history, a symbol to be argued over forever. His family wept quietly in the courtroom, the sound muffled but devastating. To them, he wasn't just a symbol or a story. He was flesh and blood, a man they loved, now taken from them by both his choices and the system that punished him. The marshals moved to escort him out, the cuffs clinking, the sound of finality. Fisher walked tall, but each step carried the gravity of permanence. For the government, the sentencing was a victory parade. They had broken the council, dismantled Harlem's ruling syndicate, sent a message to every hustler who thought legitimacy could shield them. RICO had worked. The council was gone. Barnes's betrayal had delivered results, and Guy Fisher was locked away for life. But behind the celebration, there was something haunting. Fisher wasn't a street-level dealer with no vision. He was intelligent, ambitious, capable of building beyond the underworld. The Apollo had proven that. The sentence wasn't just about punishing a criminal. It was about erasing a possibility, ensuring that whatever he could have been beyond heroin would never be realized. In that way, the punishment carried both justice and tragedy. Inside prison walls, Fisher faced a new reality. The discipline that had once carried him through Harlem streets would now have to carry him through decades of confinement. Life plus years meant there was no bargaining, no appeal to time. He would grow old in a cage. He would die in a cage. And every night, as he lay in his bunk, he must have thought of the Apollo's lights, glowing without him, a dream that slipped away into history. At 36, most men are still climbing, still imagining futures. For Fisher, the climb was over. His future was sealed by the clang of a cell door. The ambition that once propelled him now had nowhere to go but inward. And as he stared at prison walls, he must have asked himself the question that haunted him most. Was it worth it? The money, the power, the status, none of it mattered now. Only the consequences remained. Life without parole isn't just a sentence. It's an erasure. It strips a man of the arc of time, reduces him to a number in a system, freezes his story at its worst moment. For Guy Fisher, the sentence didn't just take away freedom. It took away the possibility of redemption, the chance to write a different ending. The Apollo would go on without him. Harlem would go on without him. The world would go on without him. And he would remain behind walls, a ghost of what could have been. As he was led away, the courtroom emptied, leaving behind echoes of words too heavy to forget. Life without parole. 36 years old. The story of Guy Fisher, the drug lord who bought the Apollo Theater, was no longer about ambition or dreams. It was about the finality of choices, the weight of betrayal, and the silence of a future cut off before it could ever change. And yet, even in that silence, the story wasn't over. Because history has a way of remembering men like Fisher not just for what they did, but for what they might have been. And in that space between guilt and possibility, his name would linger, debated, dissected, never forgotten. Chapter 20, Appeals Denied. The first appeal carried hope. Not the kind of reckless hope born on the streets, but the measured hope of lawyers in crisp suits, of paperwork stacked high, of arguments carefully framed. They said the trial had been unfair, that testimony from a bitter informant had poisoned the jury, that evidence had been stretched too far. They told Guy Fisher that the system might give him another chance, that the sentence of life without parole could be challenged. But appeals are slow rivers. They wind through the courts, taking years to reach their destination. And when the first ruling came back, the words were heavy. Denied. The conviction stood. The sentence remained. For Fisher, it was like hearing the verdict all over again. One word, denied, and the cell around him seemed smaller. He told himself it was only the beginning, that appeals often failed at first, that persistence could bring results. But deep down, a seed of resignation began to grow. The courts had spoken once. Now they were speaking again, and their language was finality. The lawyers pressed on. They filed again, reshaping arguments, finding new angles. They challenged RICO, saying the law had been wielded too broadly. They argued that the Apollo was legitimate business, unfairly smeared as a front. They insisted that Barnes's betrayal should not be the cornerstone of conviction. Each motion was another shot in the dark, another attempt to carve daylight into walls that refused to crack. Years passed. Appeals moved from district courts to circuit courts, and eventually to the highest court in the land. Each time, the result was the same. Denied, 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 like drum beats. Each denial hammered deeper into the reality that the sentence was immovable. Fisher read the rulings in silence, his discipline unbroken, but inside he felt the weight of decades pressing down. The law had patience, and patience had no mercy. For him, The appeals process became less about hope and more about ritual. Lawyers filed, courts rejected, and life in prison continued. He aged. The sharpness of his suits was replaced by the dull fabric of prison uniforms. The applause of the Apollo was replaced by the clang of metal doors. And yet, each time an appeal was filed, a flicker of possibility returned, only to be extinguished again by the cold language of the courts. The irony was bitter. The same discipline that had once made him a leader now made him endure. He didn't rage. He didn't collapse. He waited, he studied, he survived. But endurance isn't freedom. It's a cage with walls that grow higher as the years slip by. In Harlem, his name faded from headlines, replaced by new hustlers, new scandals, new stories. The Apollo changed hands again, moving on without him, its lights still glowing while he remained in darkness. For younger generations, Fisher became a story told in fragments, the guy who owned the Apollo, the one Barnes flipped on. The debates of the past dimmed, replaced by fresh battles. But for Fisher, time didn't dim. It stretched. Each year another reminder that appeals could not open doors once locked. The courts wrote their reasons with precision. The evidence was overwhelming, they said. The trial had been fair. The law had been applied correctly. They praised the jury's decision, the prosecutor's strategy, the testimony of Barnes. In their rulings, Fisher wasn't a man. He was a defendant, a case number, a symbol of the drug wars. And symbols rarely win appeals. For Fisher's family, the process was its own torment. Each new filing brought fragile hope. Each denial reopened wounds. They watched him grow older in prison, their visits filled with smiles that try to hide sorrow. They held on to the idea that someday, some court, somewhere, might listen differently. But the years taught them what Fisher already knew. Life without parole meant exactly what it said. And yet, inside prison walls, Fisher did not wither. Denial after denial hardened him, but it also reshaped him. He studied, he read, he sought knowledge. If the courts would not give him freedom, he would find another kind of escape in books, in education, in the act of rebuilding himself from within. The discipline that had once fueled his empire now fueled survival in a place where time was endless and choices were few. Still, every appeal that came back denied reminded him of the fragility of ambition. He had once owned a piece of Harlem's soul. He had once believed legitimacy could shield him. And now, the law had sealed his fate with a word. Denied. It wasn't a gunfight. It wasn't a betrayal in a dark alley. It was paperwork, signatures, and rulings. Quiet, bureaucratic finality. Decades passed, and Fisher remained. Appeals stacked like fallen leaves, each one indistinguishable from the last. Courts denied him again and again, until even his lawyers spoke of the process with less fire, more resignation. The noose had tightened long ago. The appeals only confirmed it. In the end, Fisher's story became not just about rise and fall, but about permanence. The permanence of choices, the permanence of betrayal, the permanence of a sentence that no court was willing to undo. At 36, he had been told he would never walk free. And decades later, the courts repeated the same message. The door remained closed. Late at night, in the silence of his cell, he must have thought of the Apollo, its lights glowing over 125th Street, the applause rising from its seats. He must have thought of the boy in the Bronx, the man at the council's table, the dreamer who wanted more than corners and cash. And he must have wondered if history would ever see him as more than the sum of his conviction. Because appeals can delay, appeals can question, appeals can argue. But in his case, appeals never changed the ending. Life without parole remained life without parole, and the word denied followed him like a shadow. The gavel had fallen years ago. The appeals only made the echo last longer. Chapter 21, Scholar Behind Bars. The clang of the prison door had closed years earlier, but Guy Fisher refused to let it close on his mind. Where others surrendered to the monotony of time, he began carving out a new path in the only place left to him, his own intellect. It started with books, thick volumes that carried him far from concrete walls. Law, history, psychology. Economics. Each page was a crack of light in the dark, a reminder that though his body was caged, his mind could still wander freely. At first, it was survival. Long sentences stretch like deserts, and men who don't find water lose themselves. But as Fisher read, the discipline that had once made him a leader in Harlem sharpened into something new. He wasn't just absorbing knowledge. He was remaking himself. One degree came, then another. Bachelors, then masters. The same ambition that once drove him to own the Apollo now drove him to conquer classrooms built out of correspondence courses and prison libraries. Prison is often described as a warehouse for time. For most, days bleed into nights. Years collapse into sameness. But Fisher refused to be warehoused. He rose before dawn, studied at metal desks under flickering lights, turned noise and chaos into background static while he pushed through textbooks. While others gambled away hours or fought over scraps, he wrote essays, analyzed case law, memorized theories. He was no longer just Guy Fisher the drug lord. He was becoming Guy Fisher the scholar. But knowledge, once gained, rarely stays locked inside. Soon, other prisoners began noticing. They saw him hunched over papers, heard him discussing concepts far beyond prison gossip. Men who once approached him for street advice now came with legal documents in their hands, asking for help with appeals, parole, grievances. And Fisher didn't turn them away. He explained, he guided, he translated the dense language of the courts into words that could be understood. Slowly, he became a mentor. Prison is full of men abandoned by schools long before they were abandoned by society. Many had never finished high school, never read a book cover to cover, never believed they were capable of more. Fisher saw this and recognized the faces. They looked like the young boys he once knew in the Bronx, hustlers with ambition but no outlet, intelligence but no direction. And in that recognition, something shifted. He began teaching. It wasn't formal, not at first. A handful of men at a table, Fisher explaining the basics of math, the structure of essays, the importance of discipline. But word spread. Soon, the small group became larger, and the prison's education wing saw something rare. Men lining up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Fisher taught with the same intensity he once brought to business, the same vision he once brought to the Apollo. Only now, his empire wasn't heroin or nightclubs. It was knowledge. Degrees came in steady rhythm. He earned one, then another, pushing through programs that few prisoners dared attempt. The irony was sharp. Outside, he had once built an empire by bending rules, by mastering the art of discipline and crime. Inside, he was now mastering the discipline of education, playing by rules that demanded patience and persistence. And with every degree, his legend transformed. Even guards noticed. Inmates who might have been volatile were calmer in his classes. Men who might have wasted years began writing essays, applying for GEDs, chasing the same path he had carved. Fisher was no longer feared in prison for his past. He was respected for his present. His influence, once measured in money and drugs, was now measured in minds reshaped, in futures redirected. Yet, the transformation didn't erase regret. Each diploma reminded him of what could have been. He imagined himself as a professor outside, standing in lecture halls instead of prison classrooms. He thought of the Apollo, of how it could have been a hub not just for music but for education, for community growth. He saw the irony. The man who had once built Harlem's cultural crown now sat behind bars, teaching lessons one inmate at a time. The contrast was a wound he carried silently. Still, his resilience became its own kind of redemption. Appeals had failed, the courts had closed their doors, but within the walls he had found another way to matter. He mentored young men, some barely old enough to understand the weight of their sentences. He told them about discipline, about choices, about how ambition can save or destroy depending on where it's pointed. He became a voice not of excuses, but of warnings, a living example of how brilliance without boundaries leads to chains. Education gave him freedom of another kind. When he read, he He was no longer in prison. When he wrote, he wasn't just an inmate. When he taught, he wasn't just a man serving life. He was proof that transformation could happen even in the harshest of places. And that proof spread. Stories of Fisher's academic journey left the prison, carried by letters, by former inmates, by whispers in Harlem. The boy from the Bronx, the council's youngest, the Apollo's owner, now a scholar behind bars. And yet, prison remains prison. No degree erased the clang of cell doors, the pat-downs, the cold routines. Each accomplishment was followed by the reminder of reality. Bars closing, lights out, time marching forward without release. He celebrated milestones quietly, often alone, diplomas tucked away in the same cells that stripped him of identity. He carried both triumph and tragedy at once. As years turned into decades, Fisher became more than a mentor. He became an institution inside the institution. Guards consulted him when tensions rose. Inmates sought him for counsel. He was steady, calm, unbroken. In a world built to crush men, he had reshaped himself into someone uncrushable. But discipline carries its own weight. Even as he thrived mentally, he could not escape the knowledge that he would die behind walls. The transformation did not erase his past. It didn't erase the heroin, the lives destroyed, the betrayal that brought the council down. But it gave his story another chapter, one not written by prosecutors or journalists, but by himself. He had been many things in his life: hustler, council member, businessman, convict. Now, he was a scholar. And perhaps that is the cruelest paradox of all. That guy Fisher became the man he could have been: intelligent, driven, respected for knowledge, only after it was too late to walk free. At night, when the noise of prison dimmed and the quiet settled, he must have thought of it often. The applause of the Apollo replaced by the quiet nods of inmates. The dream of Harlem replaced by the reality of cell. The education that gave him freedom of mind shadowed by the truth of a life sentence. Because transformation is powerful. But transformation. Chapter 22, The Compassionate Release Era. The world outside had changed while Guy Fisher sat behind bars. Decades passed, presidents came and went, the Apollo changed owners again, but his sentence remained the same: life without parole. For most men, that was the end of the story. But then, whispers began to spread. New laws, new possibilities, a crack of light where before there had been none. It began with the First Step Act, signed into law in 2018. The bill was designed to give prisoners a second chance, to reduce harsh sentences, to allow compassionate release for men who had served decades and no longer posed a danger. For Fisher, the law was like a ripple in the still water of his life sentence. It didn't guarantee freedom, but allowed him to ask. And then came the pandemic. In 2020, COVID-19 swept through prisons like wildfire. Facilities designed to cage men close together became breeding grounds for the virus. The same discipline that had carried Fisher through years of confinement could not protect him from something invisible. Suddenly, men who had once resigned themselves to dying in prison found new urgency. Compassionate release was no longer just about fairness. It was about survival. Fisher was in his 70s now, a far cry from the 36-year-old who had been sentenced to life. His hair gray, his body slowed, his time stretching further behind him than ahead. He was no longer the man who had once run with the council, no longer the businessman who had bought the Apollo. He was a scholar, a mentor, a man who had spent decades teaching inside prison walls. His lawyers argued that he was not a threat, that he had transformed, that keeping him caged served no purpose but cruelty. The petitions were filed. Documents laid out his story, his transformation, his education, his decades of discipline. They highlighted his contributions as a mentor, his lack of violence in prison, his academic achievements. They pointed to his age, his health, the risks posed by the virus. And they argued that the law, at last, offered a chance for compassion. For Fisher, the process must have felt both surreal and fragile. After so many denials, after decades of appeals struck down, here was something different. Not an argument about evidence or testimony. Not a fight over the Apollo or Barnes's betrayal. This was about humanity. About whether a man who had once built an empire of heroin could now live out his final years outside walls. But compassionate release is never simple. Judges weigh public safety, history, precedent. Prosecutors pushed back, reminding the court of Fisher's past, of the heroin that flooded Harlem, of the empire he had helped build. They argued that his transformation did not erase his crimes. They insisted that life meant life, that compassion was not owed to men who had once profited from poison. The courtroom debates stretched, legal papers piled, the decision once again out of Fisher's hands. Inside prison, he waited. At his age, waiting carried its own danger. Each week of delay was another risk, another chance the virus might reach him. He had seen others fall sick, watched men carried out on stretchers, lives ending not with appeals denied but with coughs and silence. For him, time had never felt more urgent. His family prayed, his supporters rallied, old friends from Harlem spoke of the man he had become. They pointed out that he had been locked away for over 3 decades, that whatever debt he had owed had been paid with interest. They said he was proof that men could change, that transformation was real, that redemption was possible. But the decision rested with a judge, far removed from the sound of prison doors clanging shut each night. When Fisher's petition was reviewed, the court acknowledged his accomplishments, his education, his mentoring. They noted the years he had already served, the life he had built inside despite walls. But they also weighed the scale of his crimes, the devastation of heroin, the leadership role he had played. And in that balance, compassion became complicated. The decision came slowly, like everything in the system. For Fisher, each day felt like a coin flip. Freedom or permanence. Breath of fresh air or another decade behind bars. He had endured appeals denied for years. But this was different. This was hope sharpened into something he could almost touch. That hope carried its own kind of weight. When the ruling was read, it didn't deliver the clean ending he might have dreamed of. Compassionate release was debated, argued, sometimes granted to others, sometimes denied. For Fisher, the process stretched on, filled with uncertainty. One moment, the door seemed to crack open. The next, it slammed shut again. He remained in prison, his life still tethered to the same walls. But something had shifted. For the first time in decades, his story was being told not just as a cautionary tale, but as a question. Should a man who had changed, who had educated himself, who had mentored others, be allowed to walk free? Or should his past forever define him, no matter what came after? The First Step Act had not erased his sentence. COVID-19 had not freed him, but they had raised the possibility, however fragile, that the story of Guy Fisher might not end in a cell. And as the world outside moved on, Harlem changing, the Apollo glowing with new ownership, inside, Fisher still waited, still studied, still mentored, holding on to the faint possibility that compassion, after decades of judgment, might finally reach him. But compassion is never guaranteed. And in the silence of his cell, one question lingered. Would he ever breathe free air again? Or would the dream of release remain? Chapter 23, Walking Free. The gates opened slowly, groaning against decades of rust and memory. A man in his 70s stepped into the sunlight, his shoulders a little stooped, his face lined with years, but his stride steady. It was 2020, and after 36 years behind bars, Guy Fisher was walking free. The air outside felt sharper than he remembered, colder, filled with sounds that were both familiar and foreign. Cars honking in rhythm, the chatter of strangers, the smell of city air heavy with exhaust and food. For most people, it was ordinary. For Fisher, it was overwhelming. He had entered prison in the 1980s, when Harlem pulsed with a different beat, when payphones lined corners and the crack epidemic was only beginning. Now, the world buzzed with glowing screens, wireless voices, machines in pockets that seemed like science fiction decades earlier. He blinked in the light, taking it in, his first steps as a free man slower than he once imagined. Freedom, after so long, carried its own weight. It wasn't a sprint. It was a careful walk, each step reminding him that the earth beneath his feet was no longer concrete layered with steel bars. It was open ground, fragile and real. The decision that led to this moment had not been easy. Judges weighed his age, his health, his decades of transformation. They read about the scholar behind bars, the mentor who had guided younger inmates, the man who had long since ceased to be a threat. Compassion had finally bent a system that once refused him. Life without parole had become life with a second chance. And yet, freedom after decades isn't a return. It's a rebirth. The world outside had changed, and Fisher was a stranger in it. He no longer stepped out as the sharp-suited businessman who once ran Harlem clubs and signed deeds to the Apollo Theater. He stepped out as an elder, 73 years old, carrying wisdom etched by loss and time. For a moment, he stood still, listening to the rush of the world. Then he walked forward, leaving behind the gates that had defined him for half his life. His release was not marked by applause or headlines. It was quieter, more fragile. A handful of family and supporters embraced him, their tears mixing with laughter, their arms holding him as though he might vanish again if they let go. For them, this was a miracle. For him, it was the start of a life he had never dared to fully imagine. The first car ride after prison is always surreal. Roads stretch wider, buildings rise higher, lights blur faster. For Fisher, each passing block was a reminder of time lost. Harlem had transformed. The Apollo still stood, its marquee glowing, but it no longer belonged to him. Gentrification had altered neighborhoods, old haunts erased, new faces filling streets once ruled by familiar shadows. He looked out the window like a man seeing the world for the first time, because in many ways he was. Freedom carried joy, but also questions. Who was Guy Fisher now? No longer the hustler, no longer the drug lord, no longer the prisoner. He had studied, taught, mentored, transformed. But outside the walls, those titles carried little weight. The world would remember him as the man who bought the Apollo with drug money, the council member betrayed by Barnes. But he wanted to be more. He wanted to live not as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of what transformation could mean. Walking free at 73 meant carrying both legacy and burden. He could never erase the past, the heroin, the destruction, the choices that led him to life without parole. But he could show what came after. He could show that men can change, that education can rebuild, that redemption, even late, is still redemption. The first nights outside prison were restless. Silence was different without the clang of doors and the hum of guards. Beds felt too soft, spaces too open. Freedom was strange, almost frightening. He paced, adjusting, reminding himself that the walls weren't there anymore, that he could step outside, breathe air without fences, look at the sky without bars slicing through it. And yet, freedom carried another kind of pressure. He was proof of possibility, but he was also watched. Every move, every word, every step became part of his new story. Would he stumble? Would he live quietly? Would he find a way to use his years of knowledge to help others? The questions hung heavy. In interviews, he spoke softly, measured, the way he always had. He described his journey, the transformation, the education. He didn't deny his past, but he didn't glorify it either. He carried it like a scar, visible, undeniable, but no longer the wound it once was. He wanted to be remembered not just for what he had done, but for what he had become. The irony was sharp. Freedom came not at the height of his power, not in the years when he might have reshaped Harlem with his vision, but in old age, when time was short and strength limited. He had spent the best years of his life behind bars. What remained were years borrowed, fragile, precious. But borrowed years can still matter. And for Fisher, walking free at 73 was not just survival. It was proof. Proof that men could endure, that even life without parole was not always final, that transformation can matter even when time is nearly gone. Still, the past lingered. Walking Harlem streets, he saw ghosts, Faces of men long gone, buildings demolished, corners erased. The Apollo stood, but it reminded him less of triumph and more of loss. It was no longer his. It was part of history, a history that carried his name, but not his ownership. He looked at it with both pride and regret. Pride that he had once dared to buy it. Regret that the way he had done it led to everything that followed. Freedom at 73 is not the same as freedom at 36. It comes with aches in the body, with memories that weigh heavy, with fewer years ahead than behind. But it also comes with clarity. Fisher knew what he wanted. He wanted to teach, to mentor, to use his story as a warning and as inspiration. He wanted to prove that the boy from the Bronx, the Council's youngest, the Apollo's owner, the prisoner, the scholar, all those men could be more than their mistakes. And yet, the question lingered. Would the world allow him that? Would Harlem see him as a teacher, or forever as a drug lord? Would history remember him for the Apollo's glow, or for the heroine's destruction? Would freedom be a chance at redemption, or just a final chapter written too late? The gates had opened, and Guy Fisher had walked free. But freedom is not the end of the story. It is only another beginning. And for a man who had lived 36 years behind bars, the most uncertain part of his journey. Chapter 24, Hollywood and Harlem Remember. The story of Guy Fisher had always lived in shadows, whispered in Harlem barbershops, told in fragments by men who had seen him rise and fall. But decades later, when the gates of prison finally released him, his story began to glow again. This time not under the neon lights of nightclubs or the marquee of the Apollo, but in the lens of Hollywood. News spread that Debbie Allen, the legendary actress, dancer, and director, had shown interest in bringing Fisher's story to the screen. It wasn't just a passing curiosity. To Allen, the tale of a man who rose from the South Bronx, joined the Council, bought the Apollo Theater, and then remade himself as a scholar behind bars carried weight far beyond crime. It was tragedy and redemption, betrayal and ambition, Harlem and America. It was Shakespeare with heroin and velvet curtains. For Harlem, the news sparked memory. Suddenly, old conversations reignited. Elders recalled the 70s, when heroin flooded the streets and the Council ruled like kings. They remembered the day Fisher bought the Apollo, when pride and suspicion mixed in equal measure. They remembered the trial, the betrayal of Barnes, the guilty verdict. And they marveled at the irony, that now, after 36 years in prison, Hollywood wanted to retell it all. Public fascination grew. Younger generations, who had never known the Council's reign, learned his name for the first time. They didn't see him only as the drug lord who bought the Apollo. They saw him as the man who had walked free at 73, who had earned degrees behind bars, who had become a mentor in prison classrooms. To them, his story wasn't just a fall. It was a transformation, and transformation sells. Fisher himself watched with quiet caution. Fame had never been kind to him. The Apollo spotlight had brought government suspicion. The cover of a magazine had fueled law enforcement fury. Public fascination had once destroyed him. Now, it returned, this time framed as curiosity, as admiration, as the hunger for stories of redemption. He knew better than anyone that attention was dangerous. But he also knew that stories outlive men. And maybe this was his chance to shape his story, rather than have it shaped by prosecutors and headlines. Debbie Allen's involvement gave the project credibility. She wasn't a stranger chasing sensationalism. She was an artist who understood legacy, who understood how Harlem's stories weren't just about crime, but about culture, community, resilience. To Allen, the Apollo wasn't just a backdrop. It was a character in the story, as alive as Fisher himself. Its lights, its music, its audiences. It was all part of the drama that defined his life. But Hollywood has its own codes, its own betrayals, its own risks. Studios love crime stories, but they love them simple. Rise, fall, punishment. Fisher's story wasn't simple. It was complicated, layered with contradictions. He had destroyed and built, betrayed and been betrayed, dreamed and been crushed. Would Hollywood flatten him into a villain or glorify him as a folk hero? Or could someone like Allen hold the balance, telling the truth with all its shadows. The renewed attention brought Fisher back into Harlem's conversation. Journalists called, podcasters asked for interviews, documentarians circled. Everyone wanted a piece of the man who had lived two lives. One as a drug lord, one as a scholar. In a world addicted to stories of crime and redemption, his tale was irresistible. For Fisher, the attention was both gift and burden. He had always wanted to be remembered for more than heroin. And now, decades later, he was being remembered for his transformation. But memory is slippery. Every retelling reminded the world of the heroin too, of the destruction of the Council. He could not escape the shadow of the past, even as he tried to live in the light of the present. In Harlem, the Apollo's marquee still glowed, tourists lining up for shows, unaware of the man who once claimed it as his crown. To some, seeing Fisher's story revived was painful, a reminder of the addiction that had scarred their families. To others, it was inspiring proof that men could change. The city was divided, just as it had always been about him. And maybe that was the truest measure of his story, that it could never be told without conflict. Debbie Allen pushed forward, working to capture the layers of his life. Not just the drug lord, not just the prisoner, not just the scholar, but all of them, together in one narrative. Because to reduce him to one would be to miss the tragedy and the brilliance of his journey. His story was not about one identity. It was about the collision of many. As Hollywood circled and Harlem remembered, Fisher himself walked carefully. He gave interviews sparingly, his words measured, his tone soft. He didn't chase cameras. He didn't seek headlines. He had learned long ago what too much spotlight could bring. Instead, he let others tell it, hoping that maybe, for once, the telling would be fair. And yet, in the quiet, he must have wondered, what would the world do with his story? Would they glorify the hustle and ignore the destruction? Would they highlight the Apollo and forget the attics and stairwells? Would they celebrate his scholarship but erase the lives lost to heroin? The power of storytelling is that it can preserve or distort. And for a man whose life had been defined by both ambition and betrayal, distortion was always a risk. Still, there was something undeniable about the renewed fascination. After decades behind bars, after appeals denied, after a sentence meant to erase him, he had emerged into a world that remembered. He was no longer just a cautionary tale whispered in Harlem. He was a story being told on stages larger than he ever imagined. But stories have consequences. And as Hollywood drafted scripts and Harlem debated his name, one truth lingered. Guy Fisher had walked free, but freedom was fragile. And the way the world chose to remember him could either cement his redemption or drag him back into shadows he had tried so hard to escape. Chapter 25, Legacy of the Apollo Dawn. The lights of the Apollo still glow over 125th Street, casting their neon reflection on the sidewalks of Harlem. Crowds still gather beneath the marquee, laughing, arguing, snapping photos, waiting for the music to start. To most, the theater is history, a cultural shrine, a stage where legends were born. But for those who remember, its glow carries another name, a man who dared to buy it, a man who carried Harlem's crown jewel into the underworld and back again. Guy Fisher. His name endures not just because of what he did, but because of what he represented. He was the boy from the Bronx who clawed his way up through hustling and charm. He was the council's youngest, chosen by Barnes himself. He was the businessman who tried to straddle two worlds, the outlaw and the legitimate, the drug lord and the Apollo's owner. And he was the prisoner who turned scholar, who walked free after 36 years with degrees in his hands and scars in his soul. His legacy is contradiction. To some, he was a visionary, proof that ambition could lift a man beyond corners and alleys, that Harlem's sons could claim institutions once denied them. To others, he was a destroyer, a man whose empire of heroin left scars that never healed. Both are true. That's why his story lingers. It doesn't fit neatly into villain or hero. It lives in the gray space where ambition and destruction intertwine. The Apollo made him more than a street legend. It turned him into a symbol, The theater had always been a temple of legitimacy, a place where music healed, where art thrived, where Harlem's pride found its voice. For a drug lord to own it blurred the line between crime and culture, between hustling and business. It forced people to ask questions that never had easy answers. Can money born of destruction build something beautiful? Can ambition erase the blood that fuels it? Those questions followed him long after the purchase. In the courtroom, prosecutors pointed to the Apollo as arrogance, proof that Fisher believed he could hide in plain sight. In Harlem, some whispered admiration, that one of their own had bought what corporations never care to save. Others spat disgust, saying heroin's poison could never be redeemed by velvet curtains and applause. And in prison, Fisher himself must have wrestled with the irony. His proudest achievement had also been his downfall. Betrayal runs through his story like a thread. Barnes bringing him into the council, then turning on him in a courtroom. Rumors about a mistress sparking fury that never died. Brothers who once swore loyalty, watching silently as he fell. And yet, betrayal is only one side. Fisher betrayed too, by choosing heroin, by chasing legitimacy with poison money, by believing he could bend both worlds without breaking. In the end, betrayal was not just personal. It was systemic, cultural, inevitable. That is why his story feels timeless. Because it isn't just about Harlem in the 70s. It is about every man who has tried to turn outlaw power into legitimate legacy. It is about the blurred line between crime and business, the tightrope between ambition and ruin. Wall Street bankers, corrupt politicians, hustlers in every city. Fisher's story is a mirror, reflecting how power often comes from the same source, only dressed differently. When he walked free in 2020, the fascination reignited. Hollywood circled, Harlem remembered, journalists dug through archives. Debbie Allen's interest in telling his story wasn't just about Fisher. It was about the questions he embodied. What do we do with men who change? Can redemption rewrite legacy? Or does the past forever shadow it? If a drug lord becomes a scholar, what name survives? Criminal, mentor, or both? For Fisher, the legacy is out his hands now. He shaped parts of it. The Apollo, the prison classrooms, the interviews where he spoke softly of transformation. But the rest belongs to memory, and memory is fickle. Some will remember the heroine. Some will remember the theater. Some will remember the scholar. And many will remember all three, tangled together in a story that resists resolution. The Apollo still stands, a reminder of ambition and downfall in one. It is easy to look at its glowing lights and forget the weight behind them. Easy to clap for the music and ignore the ghosts of the past. But if you listen closely, beneath the applause, you can still hear whispers of the council, of the betrayals, of the man who once believed he could buy legitimacy with outlaw money. Guy Fisher's name endures because it forces us to confront the contradictions we prefer to ignore. That men can be brilliant and destructive. That ambition can build and destroy at the same time. That redemption can be real, but never erases scars. He was not the villain prosecutors painted. He was not the hero some admirers claimed. He was both. And maybe that's why his story matters. In the end, the Apollo Don became less about power and more about paradox. His life is a reminder that every dream carries risk, that every empire casts shadows, that every choice leaves a mark. Harlem remembers him not because his story is clean, but because it isn't. Because it forces a city and a nation to grapple with the blurred line between crime and legitimacy, between ambition and betrayal. And as the Apollo's lights shine into the Harlem night, his name lingers in the glow, neither erased nor absolved, just remembered, because some legacies are too complicated to fade.